For someone from the outside, the cooking process was a very ordinary matter, but this person, while mixing rice with shrimp and vegetables in a wok, was watching the whole art of fire dancing with food. The one who stood at the stove creating another masterpiece was devoted to Chinese cuisine, as he was to nothing else in his life, and with everything that concerned food, he was on first-name terms. The love for Chinese cuisine was born in early childhood, thanks to someone who made delicious food for the baby that was hard to refuse. One evening, when the house inside was enveloped in a most pleasant aroma, the father called his little son to dinner, and that time it was Youngman, whose appetizing appearance delighted the boy. A juicy and flavorful dish, Jangmin, was a sweet and salty bean paste that was fried with onions and pork. The contented child devoured the paste with both cheeks, and the father only had to ask once again whether it was really that tasty, to which the child, with his mouth full, answered in the affirmative. It was that evening, being so young, that the boy proclaimed Youngman to be the most delicious dish in the whole world, and it was that very impression that was born deep inside and followed him throughout his life. And when the young man turned 18, he went to China to turn his dream into a goal of becoming the best chef of Chinese cuisine. But everything was not as easy as it seemed at first glance, and the problem crept up unnoticed at first, but it was not far away, but right behind the guy's back in the form of other cooks who were already whispering something to the chef. Unfortunately, the head of the kitchen was influenced by the words of the other cooks, and he was practically breathing down the boy's neck. The boss approached the guy, distracting him from such an important process, having a great desire to clarify something for everyone, and then it was clear that things were already starting to smell wrong. The young man began to sweat so much he was nervous, preparing for the worst-case scenario of this conversation. And the problem was in the custom of Guanxi, which had a long history and meant something like family ties or nepotism, and the chief began to ask questions, whether they were from the same family, province, or school, and the answer, of course, was negative. And for obvious reasons, a stranger like this guy had nothing to count on in this kitchen with such customs. Since connections were one of the most important priorities for admission to work in China, and everything else did not matter, the young man had no chance, and the chief made it clear that he did not belong there. Despite how low the guy was brought down, he still asked the boss to give him a chance to prove himself. But the chief's decision was unshakable, and he stated his condition for the last time, that if there are no connections, then there is no work, and ordered the guy to get out of here. To his deep regret, the young man realized that his belief that he could become a great chef was a naive delusion, and he went home. Standing on board the ship, the guy felt broken and depressed, although he understood that family ties exist in the past and in the present and in any country. But for the young man's path, nepotism at work was just a huge obstacle because of which his talent and abilities, as well as ambitions, were not noticed. The guy was shaking with anger, and he tightly clutched the handrail he was holding onto so as not to fall out, and in his head there was only one desire that was currently fueled only by negative emotions. Turning in the direction from which he was floating away and leaning slightly over the handrail, the young man furiously shouted out his wish that if he suddenly died and was able to be reborn, he would never return to China. And then something went wrong. While in the cabin, the captain was drinking tea and asked his assistant if he had heard anything suspicious, but he listened attentively and replied that he had not heard anything. But as it turned out, the guy still fell overboard from the ship that was sailing to his home and sank deeper and deeper into the water. Another person would have surfaced long ago and tried to call for help, but the young man, being disappointed in his life, hesitated and began to only think about how nice it would be to surface, but he did not do it. A huge whale volunteered to help speed up the selection process, which seemed to appear out of nowhere, causing the guy, even though he was underwater, to scream out of surprise. The creature was so close that it was possible to touch it, but the young man only watched the giant. The whale swam up to the guy so that his huge mouth appeared before the man's eyes, which fortunately was closed, and the young man kept calming himself down by remembering whether whales attack people or not, and also that he swam up out of curiosity. But as soon as I thought that the whale would not open its mouth because it feeds on plankton, it, on the contrary, opened its bottomless cave, pulling a small human body into it. Even then, the thought flashed through the guy's head that he was going to die now, but his state was such that he did not understand whether it was reality or a dream. And the whale closed its mouth, showing that there was no turning back, and swam on as if nothing had happened. But surprisingly, the guy's thinking continued to exist, even though his body understood that he had actually died. The young man continued to reason in the pitch darkness about how his wish, made on board the ship, had actually come true thanks to some supreme being, while the whale meanwhile sank deeper and deeper. Even after opening his eyes, the guy still didn't understand whether he was alive or dead, but he felt that he was lying in water and looked at the sky, which was brightly illuminated by the full moon. Having already risen from the water and having come to his senses a little, the young man knew that he was now in medieval China of the Song dynasty. In this world, the young man had the name Ryu Chengwan, but that didn't make it any easier, because even after being reborn, the guy sat in the water, disappointed that this was not what he wanted at all. In the mountainous area, a man with very stern facial features and a scar on his face walked through the forest, which, together with the katana on his belt, indicated that he was a warrior who was so immersed in his thoughts that he stopped only when he felt that it had started to rain. The rain only intensified, and the warrior understood that staying in the forest was not an option, and it would be nice to find a place for a meal and an overnight stay, so he quickened his pace. The man walked in thought, not in vain, because all his attention was focused on what surrounded him, and suddenly someone rushed past behind his back. But there was no fear or anger on the warrior's face, but rather fatigue apparently from being pursued on his heels, and he tried, as far as possible, to count how many there were who wanted to kill him. The fighter had already grabbed the hilt of the sword and pulled it out a little, ready to defend himself, but he still realized that if everyone immediately surrounded him, it would be the end. But the man continued walking further and, coming out of the forest and looking ahead, to his surprise, he came across a house that looked like a tavern. The tavern was called Friendly Night, and the white sign at the entrance said that it had opened recently, and regardless of when the establishment opened, it was what a traveler needed. Ryu Jungwan hummed a song to himself while simultaneously finishing the final touches to perfection, and was glad that he was finally able to do what he dreamed of. The wait for the opening was long, but it was compensated by the joy of even just cleaning up his own establishment, where Ryu was the owner. Polishing the plates until they shined, the guy finally felt the charm of his reincarnation and was as happy as a child. And despite the fact that Ryu spent his entire fortune on opening a tavern, he was still wildly delighted by the presence of something that belonged to him, and here, he could definitely cook whatever he wanted and however he wanted. The door to the tavern opened, and the guy was distracted from his business because the first client was more important, but he did not yet know which client had come to him. Ryu, wiping his hands, walked up to the guest to greet him, but the warrior, with a gloomy expression on his face, walked past, ignoring the owner. The man, without turning around, asked for dumplings and a bottle of strong liqueur, to which the guy responded with a smile anyway, rejoicing that he was about to serve his first customer. Serving the first customer properly was a priority for Ryu, and he politely asked the guest to wait for a while and everything would be ready. But like a bolt from the blue, the warrior placed 3 iambs of silver on the table, which was too much of a price to pay for the order. And to clarify the situation, the wanderer placed his sword next to the money, wanting to explain something else to the tavern owner. Ryu felt uneasy and jumped away from the table when he saw, in addition to the large amount of money, a sword also placed on the table, which indicated that events were not going well. The guy turned to the doors, already hearing some sounds and praying that it was not what he thought, especially on the first day of opening. The warrior, seeing that the owner understood everything, held his hat as chips began to fall from the ceiling and explained that the same thing happens on a regular basis in the taverns that are located in the Middle Lands. Finally, the traveler said that the iambs on the table were payment for the upcoming destruction of the premises, and Ryu was already looking at the ceiling, which was collapsing like a matchbox house. When a sufficient number of boards had been broken through to allow one to crawl through, the leg of the one who wanted to get down from the roof was already visible. A man in a yellow suit came down from the roof with a hatchet knife in his hands, right between Ryu and the warrior, already ready to attack. Despite the risk that the guy could also be killed now, the condition of the roof worried him more than his own life. More of these bastards crawled out of the door like rats on cheese, and this time Ryu didn't get off with just a fright, and a piece of the door flew right into his face, and the scoundrel shouted at the traveler that he was a coward for deciding to hide inside. Running out to meet the uninvited guests, the fighter took out his sword and turned to the tavern owner, apologizing for the fact that he would now say something late. Having come as close as possible to the scoundrels and Ryu himself, the traveler seemed to simply swing his katana through the air, causing a clear ringing sound to be heard. And when the warrior's hat was already stained with blood, he finished congratulating Ryu on the opening of this wonderful place. In front of the wanderer stood one of the bandits, with an arm without a hand from which blood was gushing, and in which literally a second ago there was still a sword, and he was swinging at the warrior. Part of the severed hand was still holding the handle of the hatchet, but the weapon itself was already sticking out, stuck in the head of another person, which shocked not only those who were in pain, but also Ryu, who was looking at this sea of blood and body parts. The tavern owner was thrown to the floor because he was in the way, and those who were still alive rushed in another attempt to destroy this only fighter. Ryu lay down on the floor and curled up into a ball, trying to pretend that he wasn't there at all, but inside he was already dead along with his tavern. While one warrior was being attacked by 3 robbers, the guy was lying on the floor and thinking about why he was being punished like this and when it would end. Ryu looked at the silver yams and remembered the sword placed on the table and realized that he was already tired of the fact that in Murim there had not yet been a day without a massacre. And when an unknown person puts huge amounts of money and weapons on the table, this automatically means an apology for the fact that the establishment is about to be destroyed to smithereens. The only thing that made the young man rise from the floor with all his might was that he saw where all these bastards were heading. The traveler ran away from the encirclement of these dogs in yellow suits, straight into the holy of holies of the tavern, into the kitchen, and the scoundrels set off after him, which meant complete and irrevocable collapse. For a man who, even after being reborn, was completely devoted to his work, seeing what happened next with the kitchen was like death. And here again, the guy had that feeling of not understanding whether this was a dream or reality, and whether all this was happening to him at all. It made him freeze, and he didn't even react to the weapons flying around. The thoughts of the reborn were only about a new life in the form of a beautiful tavern, and memories surfaced in his head as tears welled up from the understanding that he had finally been able to achieve his goal. But now, instead of a sign about the opening, Ryu held in his hands a severed arm and a bamboo broomstick on which he leaned so as not to faint. The realization of the reality of what was happening finally took over, and the guy fell to the floor amidst all the chaos that was happening in the tavern. The rain continued to pour, and now it was noticeable in the establishment as well, since water was flowing through the broken roof by those whom Ryu had already cursed 3 times for coming here. The poor guy was washed by the waters, but he didn't care. He just prayed to heaven that he would never again meet these idiots from Murim, who only know how to sow destruction. And so the heavens heard the boy's wish again, and at the door, a certain man asked if there was anyone inside the establishment. The shock of someone coming into this chaos gave the young man a second wind, and he began to rise to his feet to see who this daredevil was. At the entrance stood a richly dressed man who explained that the weather outside was nasty and they would like to stop at a tavern, and next to him stood an even more beautifully dressed girl with her face covered, and in front of them were 2 girls who were already showing how stern they were. Ryu spat sarcasm to himself that now was the moment to stay in the tavern, but then, taking the broom in his hands, he brought himself to his senses by saying that although the situation was hopeless, these were visitors, and they needed to be welcomed, especially since they themselves had expressed their desire to stay here. One of the little girls noticed the guy and was glad that the place was not empty, and they would be served now, while the other girl was not in a friendly mood. Ryu came out to meet the guests, still in a state of affect because he was still holding the severed hand in his hand and still leaning on the broom so as not to fall to the floor, but politely invited the guests to enter. And then one of the girls hit the young man in the stomach with her own head, causing him, already weak, to spit blood out of his mouth. From the places of the tavern where there were huge holes, garbage flew out, which someone was cleaning up with terrible force, raising columns of dust, and the roof was also patched up in an instant. At the entrance there was a sign in the same shabby state as the room itself, and the floor was stained with blood. The man sincerely apologized for the servants who attacked the guy, explaining that they did so only to protect their masters. One of the little girls calmly carried the table over her head, holding it with one hand, and with the other she patted the guy on the back, saying that she forgave him. And after that, Ryu said that there would be no problems with housing since the extension was not destroyed. While the crumbs were still tidying up, Ryu admitted that everything in the kitchen was also destroyed, and all he could offer was wheat noodles, to which the man responded with understanding, saying that now was not the time to pick through food. The gentleman approached the girl with an offer to stay here today, to which she replied that she supported her father. Ryu was about to go to the kitchen, saying that he would now prepare something to eat, but he interrupted himself by looking into the girl's eyes. The beautiful creature that the guy was staring at had eyes of unearthly beauty, because there is no such blue color in any water on the planet. The color of the eyes made such a strong impression on Jongwon that he did not notice how a man appeared behind him and said that this was his daughter. The young man shuddered from the unexpected appearance of a person behind him, and the gentleman, taking it personally, asked why the guy was shaking so much, because the girl was not a ghost. The man explained to the young man that his wife was from the north, which was the reason for his daughter's unusual eyes for these parts, and while one assistant invited the lady to sit down, the other little girl who hit the guy sternly ordered him to stop staring. And to what one of the assistants asked, namely not to stare, the gentleman added that when his daughter was a baby, other children made fun of her, which influenced her attitude to being looked at. Ryu stood in complete bewilderment how this was possible, if the girl was a real beauty, and then a chill ran through his body again, because such a beautiful girl had entered such a terrible place that the guy felt ashamed. The young man overcame himself and approaching the girl bowed low, addressing the lady with the desire to tell her something very important. The strongest motivation for Ryu now was an irresistible desire to make the lady not sad. And so, looking down at the floor, the guy asked for forgiveness in advance for the awkward words he was about to say. The lady was already a little embarrassed but looked away due to the injury she received from having different colored eyes. Ryu finally squeezed out a compliment about the color of the lady's eyes, comparing them to the deepest lake, which made one want to drown in them. In order to keep the skin from peeling off his face from being flushed, the young man ran off to the kitchen, shouting that he had run off to cook food. But the girl too, even though she was wearing a mask, blushed on her cheeks and looked at the guy. Not expecting such a sudden compliment, the beauty was a little stunned. Because besides the fact that she was in some way pleased to hear this, it was also something new for her. Ryu tried to collect himself and his thoughts when he came to the kitchen, but so far the success was minimal and he could only look at what was happening there. The kitchen suffered a smaller crash than the hall, but still, there were more knives and hatchets for working with food. All that was needed was to put them away. Despondency washed over Jongwon again, causing him to simply slide to the floor, not feeling the physical or moral strength to work in such horror. But devotion to the kitchen still prevailed, and Ryu, patting himself on the face a little, told himself to pull himself together no matter what, and remember the guests who were already dying to eat. Ryu Jongwon would not be himself if he did not feed the hungry guest because he was created for this, and he began by tightening the belt on his uniform and tying a bandage on his head. The guy, having tied the last knot on the bandage, finally returned to himself, assuring that having already gone through so many obstacles, he would not give up so easily. The first thing that Jongwon picked up was a knife, of which he now had more than enough, and it became clear that wheat noodles alone would not do the job. Having picked up the wok from the floor, the young man continued to walk towards making an attempt to save the tavern, even if those sitting there would be the last guests. But one thing was clear to Ryu. No matter what disaster befell his establishment, its future fate would depend on the taste of the food he prepared. And like a true chef, Jongwon, although he was in the mood for a masterpiece dish, was distracted by the fact that he needed to at least clean up the table a little. Someone was cooking in the kitchen, someone was waiting for food, someone was in a sad mood, and the toad was sitting on a board and enjoying the rain. One of the assistants also now looked like a very hungry toad, whose stomach was not only cramping from hunger but tears were welling up in her eyes. The little girl who was ready to tear Ryu to shreds was now crying at the table, waiting for food from him and shouting that she was so hungry that she was about to kick the bucket, while the second one was encouraging her partner and assuring him that he wouldn't die. Just as the gentleman was about to go to the kitchen to inquire about the situation with the food, since quite a bit of time had already passed, the aroma of food that was already prepared reached his nose. Having inhaled the smell that was coming from the kitchen, the man wanted to quickly find out what kind of dish had such a wonderful aroma. Jongwon apologized to the guests for the wait, and himself was soaked in the aroma of food, and came out of the kitchen with a tray of food that was about to be removed from the fire and steaming. The hungriest assistant continued to call the guy a demon, only now she also demanded that he give her food quickly, to which the other stopped her, since the food is given to the elders first. The gentleman looked into the bowl and was surprised why everything there was black, since the cook had initially offered them wheat noodles. Ryu continued to serve the food in bowls on the table and replied that yes, he had prepared noodles. Jongwon presented this food to the guests as his new unique dish, but did not tell them that it would appear in South Korea about 1,000 years later, becoming the standard of local cuisine. Having served the last portion on the table, where, like the others, there were noodles with fried onions and pork, as well as vegetables and egg, Zhongwan announced its name, Zhongmen. The gentleman asked for forgiveness in advance for his question, because he understood that the situation in the tavern was quite deplorable, and after a short silence, he stared into the bowl. And when he looked at the dish again, the man asked why the food was such a black color, which was quite logical for people of that era. The gentleman thought that due to the deplorable situation both in the tavern and in the kitchen, the food was burnt, which is why it looked so creepy. Zhongwan assured the guest that he would never serve them spoiled food and asked him to try the dish anyway. The hungriest of the assistants couldn't resist, and after trying the noodles, she quietly said that it was incredibly delicious because she herself couldn't believe that such a thing could even happen. But the gentleman had already seen the girl's reaction, and after eating a little more, the baby's face changed, and she told her master that he really should try it. The girls, while eating noodles, seemed out of their minds from such a new sensation in food, and it was no longer a matter of hunger but rather of taste. As a nobleman, the gentleman may have been afraid that the food was poisoned and was still afraid to start trying it, but now his stomach was cramping. The man leaned over the bowl once again, and it still looked rather unusual to him, but the smell was so enticing that he no longer had the strength to hold on. The assistants couldn't tear themselves away from eating noodles, and the one who immediately hated Ryu, calling him a demon, was now the first to say that the taste of this food was dangerous. Another assistant picked up on this conclusion and added that it was as if drugs were mixed in, because there was a strong dependence on the noodles and you wanted to eat them again and again. Ryu hesitated, thinking that his secret for preparing this dish had been revealed and was worried that this would be the final collapse of his career. Zhongwan was afraid that the assistants of the master and mistress had figured out his main additive to the dish, which they called a drug, but in fact it was monosodium glutamate to enhance the taste. To make traditional noodle sauce, beans and wheat are ground and salt is added to them like any other dish to make it less bland. But considering that the closest taste for Koreans, which is called chungjang, is created by caramel sauce, but in the era in which the guy was reborn there was no such thing, he had to find a way out. How the cook grieved in the kitchen when he realized that the taste of the dish was not at all the same as it was in his past life, and only fermented beans and wheat were missing to convey the taste of chungjang. Wanting to achieve the desired taste, Ryu tried what was at hand, namely high-dye seaweed, which contained a high amount of glutamic acid, and shiitake mushrooms, which contained guanilic acid as a flavor and aroma enhancer. The two ingredients were perfect for conveying the flavor that Zhongwan was aiming for, so he dried the ingredients and ground them. The gentleman was noticeably nervous as he held in front of him the strange paste, which he had seen served like this for the first time in his life. The man's excitement was not unnecessary, because if we speak in the words of the world of Marima, Ryu, knowing how to cook things that people had not yet tried, wielded in the kitchen no worse than those who had weapons in their arsenal, which put visitors into a stupefied state. And finally it happened, and the man used chopsticks to put some of the noodles into his mouth, but with such trepidation as if they would come to life and kill him. The more the gentleman sucked the noodles into his mouth, the more his eyes widened and his taste buds exploded inside, spreading an incredible sensation throughout his body, which was further reinforced by hunger. To experience chungjang was the moment that was considered to be the level of a heavenly demon in medieval China. The gentleman was intoxicated by the divine taste of the disgusting-looking noodles and began to suck it in so actively that he looked like an octopus. Having stuffed his cheeks to the brim with the terribly delicious noodles, the gentleman really did look like a man possessed who had not only stuffed food into his mouth but swallowed someone's soul. For some time, the man sat with his head thrown back, not having the strength to overcome such a strong influence of food on his body. Ryu could only watch and wait for the guest's verdict, but the reaction he saw was quite usual, since once you try such a treat once, it is difficult to stop. The gentleman was so relaxed that he placed the chopsticks in the bowl to fully enjoy the wonderful balance of sweetness and richness. From the pleasant warmth that spread throughout the body, the gentleman's cheeks turned red, and he said out loud that the noodles had an unusual taste due to the fact that they were infused with the taste of pork. The gentleman was so impressed that he was ready to drown in the dish and did not notice anyone or anything next to him, and his thoughts were only about the taste that he imagined. Such a loud burp came from the tavern that the birds took off from the tree and flew away from the threat that seemed to them to be a terrible beast. The assistants, while also mashing their noodles, opened their mouths in surprise at what they were just hearing. The daughter was also shocked by what her father had just said, and she didn't need to say anything or take off her mask because everything was red in his eyes. But the man leaned back in his chair, breathing heavily but contentedly, holding his stomach, into which sank the most delicious food he had ever tasted. Since there was no longer any so-called drug in the bowl, this brought the gentleman back to reality because only now did he realize what he had done and how he looked from the outside. It was awkward for everyone who stood at the table and sat at it, but everyone tried to pretend that nothing had happened and turned away from the man while he dried himself and straightened his clothes. Ryu himself noted that something like this could definitely be counted as a success, but then he noticed something that surprised him, and immediately questions arose. Jungwon saw that the girl still hadn't even touched the bowl, and of course he politely asked why she still hadn't tried the dish. The young man immediately wanted to know what the lady thought about his cooking, so he asked if she didn't like something, but she answered that everything was fine, but hesitated about the answer to why she wasn't eating. The girl felt awkward and tears welled up in her eyes, and her father looked with bitterness at what would make any parent's heart bleed. The gentleman turned to his daughter Chan, assuring her that the dish was indeed very tasty, and moved the bowl away in order to sit closer to his daughter. The father reassured his own flesh and blood, comforting her that he would be there until she ate, so she didn't have to worry, and the girl agreed to try. Ryu didn't ask himself the question of why the girl was so worried and didn't take off her headscarf. But the first thing that came to mind was the question of when headscarves were invented. And when Young Jong removed the bandage from her face, Jongwon's reaction was completely normal, like that of a person who had never seen anything like this before. Looking at the girl, one might think that she had plump lips, but in fact her entire lower face looked like it was swollen. While Ryu was trying to find words, but only letters came out of his mouth, Father Chan was already standing behind him, clearly ready to kill the boy for any comment about the girl's appearance. Jungwon almost had a heart attack when the gentleman noticed the shocked reaction to the look on his daughter's face. And the guy thought at that moment that the man was probably shocking him with his appearance for the second time. The father, looking at his daughter, explained to Ryu that she had been suffering from an unknown disease since childhood, which manifested itself in a similar way on her face. Chung finally took a drag on her noodles while the assistant drooled on the table, and the man continued to tell her that his daughter's condition had recently worsened and they were on their way to Sichuan. The gentleman expressed his hopes that this time they would find a doctor, but Ryu, due to the complexity and incomprehensibility of the situation, did not even know what to say. The guy just silently sympathized with the girl that she was struck down by illness in the prime of her life, and then something completely unexpected happened. Completely unexpectedly for everyone, the girl fell to the floor, not just breathing heavily but choking, and both assistants rushed towards her. The father also flew up to his daughter, taking her in his arms while her face was turning blue, and she was covered in sweat, and everyone was calling her by name, asking her to wake up, but it didn't help. The next moment, the gentleman became so furious at the guy, shouting at him what he had fed his unfortunate daughter. The assistants, without orders, flew towards Ryu, preparing to kill him, or at least cripple him for wanting to poison their mistress. At that moment, everyone perceived the guy as a killer sent by a sect, and not as a cook whom they had praised for a dish a moment ago. Ryu stood there, neither alive nor dead, realizing that death could indeed await him now, and in his head he only had the excuse that he had just cooked noodles with black bean sauce. The girl's heavy breathing was accompanied by fever and a rash on her neck and face, and the poor thing coughed more and more, gasping for breath. The anger aimed at killing the young man evaporated, and everyone again turned their attention to Chan, fearing the worst scenario. One of the assistants was rushing around the tavern calling for help, and the father, holding his unfortunate child in his arms, shook her and asked her to open her eyes and come back to him. The situation only worsened, and in order not to lose the most precious thing in his life, the gentleman shouted to everyone to step aside because he would be filling Chong's body with his qi. The man carefully laid his daughter's body on the floor so that she wouldn't get hurt, and asked her to be patient a little longer and that everything would pass. The master took Chong's hand in his and concentrated on healing her by filling her body with his qi. A whirlwind formed around the father and daughter, as if a tornado had appeared in the tavern itself, which would finally blow it to smithereens. The assistants were blown away by the wind, and everything that they had previously set out for the meal also flew away to the side, and the slabs on the floor broke and rose as if a new mountain was about to appear there. A powerful stream of qi from the master broke through the roof of the tavern and rushed high into the sky, which spoke of how much effort had been put into healing the girl. Ryu didn't understand what was going on at all, but the only thing that really worried him was the broken roof of his unfortunate tavern again. Father was focused on filling Chong's body with his qi until he saw that she opened her eyes or that it became easier for her to breathe. And at that moment, Zhongwan realized something because having been reborn, the knowledge from his past life had not gone anywhere, and the puzzles in his head began to slowly come together into a complete picture. Carefully observing the changes in the girl's appearance, which was accompanied by swelling of the face and shortness of breath, as well as sweating, and a rash profusely on the tonsils and hands brought Ryu closer to an explanation for this condition. In addition to all the obvious symptoms, the guy remembered the words of his father, who said that the disease had been haunting the girl since childhood. Chongwan's guesses were only confirmed when the girl, who was almost dying, began to cough up blood, and this was a bad sign. The gentleman, seeing his daughter coughing up blood, cried out that her chi was moving in the opposite direction, and this only meant that something like this could end fatally. Despite the tornado that was swirling around the father and daughter, Ryu still risked turning to the master, and he turned around but was still angry at the man who tried to poison his daughter. The father cursed at the boy, shouting at him to immediately move away because anger was taking over, but also for another reason, that in that case he would kill the young man. Zhongwan made his way through the raging storm of Sir Qi in an attempt to get closer and ask something about her condition that would help complete the puzzle. When Ryu asked the man to check if his daughter's pulse was weak, a glimmer of hope flashed in the gentleman's eyes that this man knew something other than the kitchen and that this could save Chan. With great difficulty, the boy moved closer to his father and his daughter, but he gradually and confidently stepped towards them, overcoming the wind and other obstacles in his path. Ryu came close enough, covering his face so that nothing would hit him, and said his thoughts that the whole problem was precisely in the slow pulse. The boy reached out to take the girl's hand and feel her pulse, but the father was furious and told him not to touch her, and that he would do it himself. The gentleman grasped the poor girl's wrist with his palm to feel her pulse, and by that time the skin all over her body was covered in a severe rash. Holding his daughter's hand, the gentleman suddenly stopped using his chi, causing everything that was flying in the air to fall to the floor, including his assistant. While one assistant stood up and brushed off her clothes, the little girl who called Ryu Demon tried to at least stand on her feet after such a windy ride. She stopped because the gentleman really felt the slow pulse on his daughter's wrist and immediately asked Ryu a counter question. Did he really study medicine too? The young man hesitated a little, trying to find the words, and while he was able to answer something like that, it wasn't quite like that. He couldn't say that he was reborn from the modern world into medieval China, and that he retained basic knowledge about the symptoms and their treatment. And then Zhongwan heard the plaintive word, please, uttered under his breath. And when he turned in the direction from which it came, he saw a father crying from grief who was begging the guy to save his daughter. This is not at all how the tavern owner imagined the end of the first day after opening his establishment, but what happened, happened. Ryu armed himself with a bowl of water and a towel, but before that he sat down next to the lady to examine her condition. The father, with eyes swollen from tears, asked what the boy was up to, and the assistants watched the demon's actions attentively but silently. Zhongwan soaked the towel in water and wrung it out, explaining all his actions along the way, and at that moment he announced that first he needed to remove the curry from the lady's mouth. The guy turned the girl's head to the side, and carefully removing the remains of the curry, noticed that, as he had guessed, the tongue was swollen and blocked the airway, which is why the girl began to choke. All the pieces of the puzzle came together, and Ryu himself realized that the lady had suffered anaphylactic shock as an acute allergic reaction. The young man remembered how, in his past life, he served a client who had similar symptoms due to certain products, but unfortunately the man died, which is why the chef was fired. Now that Yongwan knew it was an allergy, he tried to figure out what exactly caused such an immediate reaction after eating the food. One of the assistants who couldn't stand the guy wanted to throw away a plate of noodles, but another, more collected girl stopped her partner, and this helped Ryu. The chef remembered what the dish looked like when he first served it, and how he decorated it with nut crumbs on top. And nuts are the most common thing people are allergic to. Ryu gritted his teeth in anger at himself and felt terrible guilt for his inattention and lack of intelligence. The guy looked at the poor girl and reproached himself for adding a strong allergen without even asking if the girl could eat it. So he had already branded himself as a person who did not deserve to be a cook. Before taking action that would shock everyone, Ryu sternly asked his father if he wanted to save his daughter's life, to which he unquestioningly agreed. But Chongwan asked again if the gentleman was ready to save his daughter at any cost. And now the man did not quite understand what this young man was getting at, but with his eyes he made it clear that he agreed. Since what was now threatening the guy's life was worth saving the lady, he prepared to give her artificial respiration and covered her nose. When Ryu started giving mouth-to-mouth resuscitation, which in his past life was a normal way to provide first aid to a person, for the master and assistants, it looked like a kiss, and in this case, like a perversion. The killer machines in these little girls woke up and they started shouting at the guy what he was doing, and that he was a pervert. And the assistant, who already hated the demon, was definitely ready to kill him this time. What can we say about a father who, right before his eyes, is seeing someone kissing his only daughter, for whom a fate was clearly prepared that was better than what exists now? The assistants beat Ryu and bit him, but this in no way affected the guy's desire to save the lady, and after finishing artificial respiration, he needed to understand whether it helped or not. Since Chan continued to show no signs of life, the young man realized that he needed to move on to cardiopulmonary resuscitation of the heart, and if his assistants were biting him now, then after what happened next they would simply tear him to shreds. Again, Ryu knew that for cardiopulmonary resuscitation, it was necessary to perform indirect heart massage, and for this, he had to touch the girl's chest, which simply horrified the assistants. Chongwan was doing a heart massage, sweating and realizing that he might be killed for this, but he decided to save the girl at all costs. And death really was approaching the boy right from behind in the form of Father Chan, who didn't even need a sword or any other weapon for this. The first thing Ryu felt was how his body came under pressure from an unknown force, and his vision began to double. The feeling of constriction became more and more intense with every word that came out of the gentleman's mouth. And then it became difficult for Chongwan himself to breathe, as if several hands had grabbed his throat and were gradually squeezing it. The chi was activated to its full power when the master asked how the scoundrel could look down on his daughter. When chi is reinforced by a strong emotion, and in this case anger, it becomes destructive for everyone and everything around. And since Ryu was already barely breathing, the gentleman took this as the fact that the young man did not even have anything to say in the end. Zhongwan, feeling this powerful aura on himself, grabbed his clothes in order to somehow stay alive, and then realized that the master was a great master. Ryu, being on the verge of death himself, still continued the indirect heart massage on Chan, applying all his last strength. The father's ferocity grew to terrifying proportions, and he, throwing sparks, shouted at the young man to take his dirty hands off his daughter. The assistants, standing aside, concluded that the guy would definitely not live, but what upset the demon hater most was that she would have to say goodbye to black bean noodles. The gentleman furiously shouted at the young man that if he did not stop right now, his life would end, and swung his arm to kill him. Overcoming his own strength and the feeling of fear for his own life, Ryu gritted his teeth and continued to save Chan. Youngwon screamed, "Does the father really want to let his daughter die at the moment when the master's hand almost fell on the boy, and this question made him stop?" Chi disappeared as suddenly as it appeared, and the master watched as the young man actually tried to save Chong by continuing to do what people in this era did not see as a way to help a person. Ryu continued to massage the heart, and the poor guy barely had enough strength for it, and sweat was pouring down his face considering that, before that, he himself had almost been destroyed. The father, looking at the boy's efforts, could not understand why he, forgetting about his own life, was saving the one he barely knew. And lo and behold, although Chan started coughing, she began to breathe and came to her senses, to which the assistants immediately reacted. The father also fell to his knees next to his daughter, calling her by name, and the girl, although very weak, was able to even open her eyes. The gentleman lifted his child into his arms, not believing that she had actually woken up and that Chan was even able to call out to her father. Poor Ryu, exhausted to the point of death, could no longer sit, so he simply began to lean towards the floor like a tower that was falling. The young man fell onto the broken tiles of his tavern, no longer realizing who he was or where he was, and only breathing heavily. Off to the side, he heard his father asking his daughter to be careful to save her strength, and the demon hater was crying after worrying about her mistress and now also from joy that she was alive. Moonlight fell on Ryu from the hole in the roof, and he didn't move even a small muscle in his body. He was so exhausted, but saving a man was worth it. The guy looked at the beautiful full moon and thought about how he managed to almost die on the first day of opening. But despite the raid of robbers and the tornado in the form of the master's key, everything ended well. His eyes closed and the young man fell into a deep sleep, thinking about how damn hard it was to run his own business. From the room where the sleeping place was located, heavy breathing could be heard through the terrible dream that Ryu was having. The guy broke out in a cold sweat and called for help, asking to report what had happened, and grabbed the blanket with his hand. With a cry of "Call the police!" Ryu jumped up on his bed, clearly waking up from a dream that was connected to his past incarnation. Before Zhongwan had time to wake up from his sleep and did not understand how he ended up in his room and what had happened at all, a bright glow appeared next to him. When the guy turned around to look at the glow, he saw a gentleman with streams of light coming straight from his eyes, which looked creepy for someone who had just woken up from a shocking situation. Father Chan was sitting on a chair next to the bed and was blazing with a bright flame, causing Ryu to scream in fear, which was a completely normal reaction. The young man immediately thought that the master was still angry with him because he saved his daughter with artificial respiration and heart massage. But to his great surprise, the glow stopped, and the gentleman said absolutely calmly and with a smile that they were now connected by so many things, and introduced himself to the guy as the patriarch of the Chagao clan. Ryu felt uneasy again and repeated the name Chagel Chian in his head, already being in this world, realizing whose daughter he saved. Chongwan could not believe that in front of him was one of the 7 great clans and the successor of Chiga Liang, who was also the chancellor of Shuhan, and the master asked the young man's name. But instead of his name, Ryu began to recite some text from memory, which at first the gentleman did not understand at all, but continued to listen. Imagine the patriarch's surprise when he continued listening to Chongwan's speech and heard in it something that a simple cook could not possibly know. And Ryu, raising his head, continued to talk about how the basis of every soldier's character is discipline, thanks to which he develops his body with a calm heart and cultivates good deeds through a thrifty attitude. The patriarch jumped up from his seat and cried out, "Does the young man really know the Book of Commandments?" To which he replied that he certainly knew it from beginning to end. The gentleman could not believe his ears or eyes, and then Chongwan went and said that Chegol Muhu was the person he admired most. At that moment, the guy was grateful to himself for the fact that the knowledge that had been firmly deposited in his head since his previous incarnation now helped him like never before, because he was delighted to learn everything about the chronicles of other heroes and everything that was connected with the 3 kingdoms. Ryu remembered his room, which had books and movies on the shelves, as well as miniature figures of heroes relating to the topic that interested him. The guy was most interested in the character of that time, Chigel Liang, a figurine of which he also had in his collection. Accordingly, like any person who has a favorite hobby, Ryu collected all sorts of information related to Chegol Liang. While the patriarch was pleasantly shocked by the knowledge of this young man, Chongwan himself was pleased with what a wonderful life he had lived. Suddenly, the gentleman grabbed the young man and began to shake him as if he wanted to squeeze all the spirit out of him, and Chongwan, just in case, began to beg for mercy and ask for forgiveness. But the man, admiring the boy, asked him to become part of their family, and Ryu, carefully opening one eye to check if he was still alive, asked the gentleman again what he had just said. So, frozen with his hands raised in front of the gentleman, the young man realized what the patriarch had offered him and what consequences it would lead to. Ryu introduced the gentleman as the boss of the great Guanxi gang, who offers the guy his wing and accordingly protection. The gears in his head started spinning. Zhongwan began to slowly understand what would happen if he connected his life with one of the great Chigel clans. Namely, the guy will get rid of any misfortunes and threats to his life forever, as was recently the case with the raid of robbers on his tavern. Ryu brought himself to his senses by sternly pointing out why the hell he was still hesitating with such a proposal, and getting out of bed, asked for forgiveness for such a late answer to the question about his name. The young man folded his hands in greeting and respect and introduced himself as Ryu Chungwan, which also greatly pleased the patriarch. The man immediately translated the meaning of the guy's name as Chan, which means blue, and there's that sky, and he was doubly happy because his daughter's name is Chan, and Ryu immediately asked what the gentleman meant. But the patriarch again attacked the guy, laughing and shouting that he didn't mean anything special, so he consoled the young man by saying that he didn't have to worry. The gentleman hugged Ryu a little and began to calmly talk about how, although there had been a misunderstanding between them at first, now he had nothing to worry about because from now on he was part of their family. But after these words were spoken, the patriarch hugged the young man tightly, and tears welled up in Chongwan's eyes, from the knowledge that he had finally realized that very nepotism or guanxi that he had been striving for all his previous life. While the assistants were patching the roof, the gentleman asked how old the guy was, and Ryu answered 22, And the patriarch shared that his daughter was 18, and he also asked where the young man was from, and learned that he was from Fujian province, although he almost let it slip that he was from Seoul, out of habit from his previous incarnation. The last stars in the sky were fading, giving way to dawn, and the sun made it possible to see the sleeping great mountains covered in fog. With the first rays of light he woke up, and Ryu, despite a rather eventful day yesterday, could not believe his eyes when he entered the tavern. Not only did the room look the same as when it opened, it also sparkled so nicely that it was nice to look at, and even the bloodstains had disappeared, as if there had been no massacre here yesterday. But in the kitchen there was a real chaos and noise, to which Zhongwan turned his attention second only to the tavern hall. The guy cautiously headed towards the kitchen, and when he looked in, he was surprised to see someone there starting to cook something, but was in no hurry to say anything. The assistants tried to cook something like soup to eat, but so far all they got was a strange colored brew that looked more like a potion. It was so painful for the cook to watch how terribly the girls treated the food, wasting it. The demon hater had already managed to cut herself and put on a bunch of bandages, but she continued to mercilessly chop up vegetables at random. Ryu quietly and carefully turned around to leave and not show that he had come in. But at that very moment, the hater noticed him but no longer addressed him as a demon, but called him master and asked for help. The more reserved assistant, who was stirring the potion, reminded the guy that the lady had not eaten anything since yesterday, and the hater added that although Ryu was a pervert, she cooked very well. Zhongwan exhaled that everything was fine, and they wouldn't kill him again, and realized that these bad cooks were trying to make some food for Mrs. Zhong. The young man remembered that the fault for what happened yesterday was only his, and in order to make amends, he decided to undoubtedly make food so that the girl could eat and feel better. Having removed one assistant from the wok and taken the knife from the hater just in case, which she didn't like, Ryu already started cooking. The most important criterion that Masterpiece Miracles would now be performed was the securely tightened bandage on the chef's head. Zhongwan asked his assistants to wait a little, and like a true wizard, and at the same time an expert in his field, he began to do what he did best in both his past and present lives. Ryu told the assistants that he would prepare the most delicious snack for Mrs. Zhong for those who were sick or recovering from an illness. The girls had no choice but to watch the guy cook as if he were some kind of kitchen guru performing. The hater couldn't resist and told Ryu that he was still a very responsible pervert, to which the guy thought that it was time to stop calling him that. The girl felt much better and looked at the bowl in which Master Ryu brought her food to bed. The food in the bowl, as last time, looked very appetizing and well chopped, and vegetables and sauce were served with it. The hater was wrapped up like a caterpillar in a cocoon, and not in vain because she could barely restrain herself from trying such a fragrant food. Another assistant confirmed the girl's question that Master Ryu made this food specifically for her and added his words about cutting everything as small as possible so that the lady's swelling would not interfere with her eating, which made Chan feel awkward, and she covered herself with a blanket. Also, while the assistant was recalling everything that Chongwan had strictly told them to adhere to regarding the lady's diet, the hater had already begun to gnaw the ribbons in which she had been wrapped. The assistant began to tell that first Ryu cut the zucchini into rings as is usually done, and also for the convenience of further shredding. In parallel with the fact that the master showed his assistants his skills, he also explained to them the new rules based on the lady's allergy to nuts. And the assistant had already come to the conclusion for herself that the lady really felt bad every time she ate nuts, and the hater, as if eternally hungry, was already drooling at the mere mention of nuts. Having chopped the zucchini rings into cubes in the air, the master added that the lady might be allergic not only to nuts. And when he chopped the cubes into tiny pieces, he clarified that not only pure nuts, but also various peanut butters should not be in the girl's food either. After chopping all the vegetables into such fine crumbs, Zhongwan asked the assistants to be careful in the future when serving food to the lady. Following the master's command, the hater lit a fire, and the other placed a wok on top of the stove, which already contained food, and both girls were amazed by all the processes taking place in the kitchen. Pouring broth into the wok with vegetables, Ryu also pointed out that the assistants should be vigilant with what their mistress touches, and accordingly, they allocated separate utensils and a cutting board for her. The little girls listened to everything very attentively, and at the end they nodded in unison, showing that the information had been successfully absorbed. Zhongwan warned that while the guests were here, he would personally ensure that the dishes and food were prepared separately for the lady to avoid dire consequences. The hater was already going crazy from the smells and shouted to the owner to let her try this masterpiece when the cooking was finished. Chan, having listened to everything that Ryu told the assistants, and the more reserved one looked at the spoon of food that the girl finally decided to take and said that the guy's feelings were hotter than the food he was preparing. After a day without food, the lady was able to effortlessly bring a spoon to her mouth without feeling any discomfort in the form of swelling. Having eaten just a little of the dish, it was hard for Chan to believe that someone had prepared something so amazingly delicious for her, putting care into it. The assistants were already afraid for their mistress and were ready to save her again because the girl again ate just a drop and froze. But Chan, on the contrary, felt not only the taste of the food and its texture, but also the sincere feelings that young Master Ryu had for her. A few days later, Zhongwan went outside to see the guests off, and the patriarch thanked the young man for making his daughter feel much better and added that it was time for them to continue on their journey before it got dark. The master took Ryu's hands in his and addressed him by name, wanting to say something very important to him as a father. The man once again expressed his enormous gratitude for the guy taking care of his daughter, which made Jungwon start to make excuses and become embarrassed. And then the patriarch, looking back at Chan, who was also already standing there embarrassed, told the cook that his daughter wanted to give something to the master before leaving. The girl, turning away her gaze as at their first meeting, extended the gift to Ryu, saying that it was a sign of her gratitude to him. How taken aback the guy was when he saw in his hands a token of gratitude, which in this world was considered a very important and valuable element. This token was intended to be used to ask for any help in case of any problem, and was essentially a universal pass and a golden key to Murim. Ryu looked at the token as if it were a treasure and thought timidly that even though there was a connection between them now, the gift of such a valuable thing was already a higher level. Flying back to the gentleman, the young man, burning with awkwardness, said that unfortunately he had nothing to repay them with for such generosity. The patriarch was amused by the boy's modesty, but said that these were trifles that in their situation they shouldn't even think about. Rejoicing like a child, Zhongwan, holding the token to his heart, could not believe that their relationship was so strong and realized that he still did not know a lot of things, but he was sure of one thing, that Guanxi is incredible. The hater, as always, could not remain silent and began to complain that if they did not go now, her back would fall off. Finally, the gentleman put his hand on Ryu's shoulder and assured him that he would personally take care of the preparations for the ceremony, so the young man could not worry about anything, and when the time came, people would be sent for him. At first, Zhongwan was horrified at what kind of ceremony they were talking about, but then he calmed himself down by remembering what he knew from his previous incarnation. As the guy understood, the patriarch meant the ceremony of the fraternal oath, as was proper for the descendants of Chegalgonmyeong, where men cross weapons and swear with the words that if they cannot all fly together, they will die together in battle. Ryu, having consoled himself about the upcoming ceremony for real warriors, smiled at the master and said that he understood what preparations were ahead for everything, delighting the patriarch with his fortitude. The master saw off the guests with his eyes, waving and saying, "See you at the ceremony," and also wishing them a safe journey. When the family had moved a sufficient distance, the father told his daughter that they should hurry, to which the girl, as always, agreed. Ryu continued to wave after them, and the lady listened attentively to her father about returning home and did not say anything contrary. And the gentleman himself was already imagining how they would prepare for the wedding ceremony upon returning home. The tavern continued to exist, at least in the kitchen, where life was always boiling or frying in the form of all sorts of dishes. The wind outside was flapping the streetlights, but the sign remained in place from the moment the assistants had patched up the establishment. And so Master Ryu continued to create, and quite a lot of time had passed since the moment Chigolchian came to his tavern. Chongwan cooked as usual with great desire, which doubled after the unimaginable kindness of Mr. Chong, thanks to which the tavern underwent some changes. By unthinkable kindness was meant a letter from the patriarch, to which was attached 500 iambs of silver in the form of a receipt, because the master knew that the guy would refuse, so the receipt was given by the maid who stayed with Chongwan. But the happiness did not last long, because that same hater came who declared from the doorway that she first demanded those same noodles and only then money. Everyone had their own treasures, and if the assistant was gobbling up noodles with gusto, then Ryu would look at the receipt with money that he had never had before. The master decided to use the gift money to renovate the tavern, making it a better version, but he kept the name Friendly Night. Unfortunately, the improvement of the establishment did not please the young man very much, because when serving an incredibly tasty dish once again, he carried it out into the hall with sorrow. The sad thing was that the only ardent visitor and lover of food was the assistant, who constantly hunted for everything that Zhongwan cooked. Disappointment was eating away at the guy from the inside, because if no one would visit his tavern, it would have to be closed. And the money that Mr. Chan had sent him had almost all already been spent. The hater didn't care about the feelings of the young man, because her need for tasty food was more than satisfied. But Ryu didn't understand at all why everything was happening this way. It was as if the heavens heard the boy's prayers, and the doors opened and a man entered, asking if this was the Friendly Night Tavern. The cook's eyes lit up, and he turned to the long-awaited visitors, answering that they had come to the place they were looking for. Behind the man who spoke to Zhongwan, armed soldiers entered the tavern in formation, taking measured steps toward the owner of the establishment. The guy had an alarming thought that it was rather strange to see soldiers at his place, and even a whole detachment that was clearly not in the mood for a meal. But joy was greater than fear, and Ryu ran out in front of the crowd of civil servants, shouting welcome to them and offering them any seats in the tavern, while the assistant shouted at them to stand in line, afraid that she herself would be left out. From behind the backs of the soldiers, who were huge compared to him, a short man looked out and asked the owner if he was Ryu Chongwan. The guy confirmed the man's words, and being satisfied, continued to say that since so many of them had come, he was ready to listen to all the wishes regarding the orders. But instead of orders, Chungwan and the assistant were rather quickly tied with a rope, and the hater again turned into a caterpillar, and the guy knelt down, which he did not notice at first. I was impressed by the guess. And when the assistant began to wriggle like an eel on a frying pan and puff, trying to get out, and Ryu was pulled tighter with a rope, he woke up, returning from heaven to earth in a harsh reality. The soldiers transported the detainees to the Shimwuhen State Headquarters in Sichuan Province. The reception of the guests was not only not warm, but also disrespectful, since the person to whom Ryu and the assistant were delivered was talking while chewing meat and had no intention of being distracted from his meal. When the big guy asked his assistant if this was the guy who was detained, the worker, pouring the gentleman a drink, replied that this time they had detained the right person. Shorty whispered in the ear of the district judge Po Darien that he had chosen the person who suited them in all respects. Ryu realized that he was in front of a judge and tried to explain that this was all some kind of mistake because he had never broken the law. But the guy's speech was interrupted by one of the soldiers who held him by the rope and hit him with his staff right next to him, shouting at him to shut up. The uncle continued to report to the judge that the tavern was quite well done, but this was strange because it didn't seem like someone was patronizing the guy and offering to accuse him of some crime and then take all his money. Judge Po, having finished his noodles, slammed his bowl on the table, loudly supporting the workers' words, announcing that they would make a decision and punishment, thereby giving the assistant the green light to implement his insidious plan. The uncle opened the scroll and accused Ryu Zhongwan of committing a serious crime, namely running a tavern without reporting it to the government and tax evasion. As the young man listened to this completely unfounded nonsense with his mouth open, the shorty added that his other crime was that Ryu had not joined the Cooperative Food and Drink Alliance, which he was hearing for the first time. The little man rolled up a scroll and loudly announced to the soldiers to take the boy to prison and confiscate all his property. Zhongwan shouted, still kneeling, that the crimes that were pinned on him were unjust, but after that he immediately received a kick in the back from a soldier. The soldier pressed the guy down by standing on him with his foot, and again told him to shut up. But no matter how much pain Ryu was in now, luck was still on his side because a token from Chan fell out of his clothes. Piglet Po Darien, continuing to mash the food, asked the guy to stop making noise and quickly get out of here. But then he noticed that very token. The judge carefully read what was written on the token and fell silent so abruptly, as if he had already swallowed his tongue along with all that food. He shouted for everyone to stop and, throwing food, flew down the steps straight to the token to pick it up and make sure it was real. The poor guy, sweating and groaning, could not believe that he was holding a token from Chegel Chan herself, and immediately asked the young man where he got it. Darien warned Ryu that if he decided to lie about where he got the token, he would lose his head right there on this square. Zhongwan was finally able to get up, while the judge continued to hysterically yell at the young man to immediately answer whether he stole this token or found it somewhere. But the guy calmly replied that this gift was given to him by one of the tavern's visitors, who said that it was a sign of their family, and if he needed anything, he could use it. Darien approached one of the soldiers and snatched the staff from his hands with such abruptness and force that the man did not even have time to say anything. And the judge, holding his staff in his hands, was furious and muttered through his teeth that he had been so lenient and in return had received such nastiness. The big guy swung his staff at the guy while the assistant stood and watched everything and rejoiced at how fierce the judge was. Shorty couldn't get enough of how well the corrupt official was acting, showing initiative and setting an example, so he decided that he would learn the same from the gentleman and become a great corrupt official too. But the little man's dreams were shattered just like his bones when Poe struck him with his staff so hard that blood flew out of the poor man's mouth. The assistant flew back from the blow like a toy, breaking a wooden canopy and crashing into it with his back, and everyone who saw it was shocked by such a turn. Ryu hasn't quite recovered from the fact that he just almost died, and from the fact that it turns out that his life was in danger, but not for him. Darien continued to hysterically shout at his assistant that he was an idiot and why he brought an innocent man to him and made him kneel. The poor guy crawled out of the rubble and coughed up blood, sincerely not understanding what had just happened, because the judge himself ordered him to do it, but the piglet began to squeal even louder, pouring dirt on the uncle. And in order to finally shut the mouth of the one who could now ruin everything, the judge decided to run and calm the shorty down by kicking his face into his head. After the assistant finally shut up, Poe ordered the soldiers to lock him in the dungeon immediately and be sure to shut his mouth. The brute ran up to the guy and, burning with shame and excitement, asked him, calling him brother, if everything was okay with him. The soldiers dragged the lifeless body of the assistant, and Ryu wanted to object that he was not a brother to the Lord Judge, but he stood his ground, asking to call him brother, and the assistant did not wait long and called Poe brother. Darien began to quickly untie the young man, who could not understand the turn of events, but the judge assured him that they were not strangers to each other. Poe asked Ryu that they were guanxi, after which, incredibly worried about the consequences of his treatment of the boy, the big guy began to worry even more, from which he began to sweat terribly as if he was melting. Having moved to the mansion of District Judge Poe Darien, he already exhaled, but admitted that he almost made a huge mistake. And while the demon hater was staring at what was on the table, the judge continued to fawn that he didn't know at all that the guy was one of the Cheagle clan. To appease the guests and keep them from telling about his crimes, there were so many delicacies on the judge's table that his eyes ran wild, and he asked them not to be shy and to take whatever their hearts desired. The assistant, without even thanking him, immediately began to eat, but Ryu, as a polite young man, thanked the elder and only then began to eat. Poe smiled, surprised that the young man called him senior, and repeated that they were almost old friends, so there was no need for such formality. Zhongwan was still embarrassed by such a sudden approach from the one who recently wanted to lock him up for nothing, but he called Darien bro and continued eating. While the guy was enjoying the delicacies, he thought that although he understood that the world was small, he would never have thought that the judge would end up in Guanxi with the Cheagle clan. The real chef's eyes filled with tears from how delicious it was, and Ryu thought that this was probably what Guanxi tasted like. No matter how sweetly Poe smiled, his greedy essence was unchanged, which was also shown on his face in the form of disgust towards this offspring, because he thought that Zhongwan was an ordinary villager, but he did not imagine that he would have a token of the Cheagle clan. But the big guy was most outraged by the fact that the name of Mr. Chan's daughter was on the token, which was a good reason to draw conclusions about the development of further events. Darien watched as the guy fought off the assistant, who wanted to take his food too, and realized that this young man was also Chen Feng Yu of the Cheagle clan, or simply the young lady's fiancé. The judge was so saddened, realizing how he had treated the son-in-law of the patriarch Cheagle himself, and that he might soon lose his head. Poe again began to sweat in streams from nerves, looking at the guests, and tried to console himself by hoping that they liked everything and that this would at least help somehow. Ryu noticed how Poe's face changed, and despite his mouth full of food, he still asked if he was okay. But Darien quickly came to his senses so as not to worsen the situation, and waved it off, saying that everything was fine with him, lying that his position required a lot of thinking. Zhongwan was understanding of his new brother's answer, but noted that there was so much deliciousness in front of Poe that he hadn't even touched yet. And at the same time, he was holding his assistant's leg because she had already climbed onto the judge's side of the table. Darien decided to shift the guy's focus by remembering that he understands cooking, and went from afar, saying that although Sichuan dishes are decent, they cannot compare with the food from his hometown. The judge became despondent again, and this time it was truly because his heart was filled with longing for his native land, and he confessed to the guy that he missed home. Even now, Poe felt the sound of water and the smell of the sea, and memories and the cries of birds came to mind. all about his hometown of Guangdong, which was famous for its fresh and abundant seafood. He often stood on the rocks that were washed by the sea with foamy waves, but this did not frighten him because in those moments he felt most comfortable. And along with the memories of food, other memories came flooding back, where Darion, still young, looked at the sea and felt that he wanted to make a vow. The element of living and seething water filled the body of a guy who was 21 years old when he tried to promise himself that one day he would definitely achieve success and take an official position. And taking the example of the sea, which with its breadth embraced everyone, young Darion promised to be that official who would warm ordinary people with all his heart. It was embarrassing that he became who he is now, but then he was a naive young man who did not yet know how cruel this world is. But Zhongwan didn't pay attention to who the judge was and who he became, and was already thinking about how to please his friend by remembering that his hometown, Guangdong, is famous for its seafood. Ryu jumped up from the table, turning to his brother Darian, which made the poor man nervous again, not understanding what to expect from the man of the Chagall clan. The guy securely fastened the headband on his hair, which indicated that he was preparing the most delicious food, and told the judge that, as a token of gratitude for the warm welcome, he would like to cook something for him. Coming into the kitchen and wiping his hands after washing them thoroughly, the young man gave the command to light a fire, and the assistant only followed him and sternly nodded in agreement. But no matter how nasty the hater was, she was worth appreciating for the fact that she had enough agility for 3 people. So the fire for cooking lit up instantly. The chef himself took his usual tool in the form of a hatchet, and as always began by preparing all the necessary products. Ryu resembled a warrior who confidently holds a weapon in his hands to match his life's calling, from which the food obediently chopped without offering the slightest resistance. The girls who were in charge of the kitchen in District Judge Po Darion's mansion stood to the side and quietly discussed who this guy was and what he was planning to do. And while Ryu was fully involved in the process of cooking, one of the workers said that according to rumors that had already spread, the young man was the Guanxi of the district magistrate. The girl continued to watch the guy's actions, wondering why he was doing everything alone. And at that moment, the demon hater flew up to the workers and introduced them to Ryu Zhongwan. The assistant of the Chagall family immediately told the young ladies that Ryu is a terrible pervert, Shim Wu-yun from the Sichuan province, but at the same time noted that when it comes to cooking, he is a master of his craft. And the guy, hearing all this, begged the nasty little bug in his head to stop talking nonsense about him. Zhongwan wiped the sweat from his forehead and looked at the products and realized that this was enough, and thought about how when he first saw the judge, he immediately understood his feelings. It seemed to the young man that Po really missed home and everything connected with it. But Ryu did not give up hope of calming the judge's heart and soul with the help of food that would be as close to him as memories of home. The only thing that stopped the cook a little was the problem of their location, because Guangdong was near the sea, and seafood was always available. But Sichuan was far from the coast, and it was difficult to get something similar. But Zhongwan wouldn't be a true cook if he couldn't get out of even this situation, so he simply decided to use similar ingredients. To replace the hermit crab, the choice fell on the blue crab, which was also quite meaty and had a similar taste. To compensate for the presence of sea mollusks, the master used giant shrimps, which were also good. Well, instead of sea mussels, freshwater mussels are also great, although they have a more pronounced aroma. But if you know how to cook them correctly, it will turn out just as good. Having thrown all the fish products into the wok to make a rich broth, Ryu began preparing a certain seasoning to give the dish a piquant spiciness. To replace the hot chili oil, the guy fried Sichuan peppercorns, hemp flowers, and meadow sweet flowers in canola oil with green onions and garlic. Zhongwan watched as he created with his own hands what is called ma, meaning a sharpness that binds, and la, meaning a rich sharpness. The two parts together created the enticing and piquant taste of mala, which the chef was able to perfectly recreate thanks to the addition of the right herbs. The hater was already eating a huge shrimp, while the workers, meanwhile, continued to watch the cooking process and admired the young man's skill in wielding a wok. The dish would have had no meaning without the noodles, which Ryu had already begun to cook and scooped up the piquant oil that was already ready by then. The cook added oil to the ingredients that were being prepared for the noodles in a separate wok, so 3 of them were heated at once. Only a true chef would not be afraid of the column of flame that appears when oil hits the wok, and Ryu did this so that the aroma of the oil would overpower the specific earthy smell of freshwater ingredients. One of the workers had already smelled an incredibly pleasant, pungent aroma that was so enticing, but she couldn't understand how it happened. The girls were already going crazy. They were so attracted by such a rich smell that they had never felt before. Now the workers admired the master twice as much, burning with desire to try such aromatic noodles. But the most important thing is that Ryu himself was satisfied with the work he did, and for him the dish looked perfect. Finally, Jongwon came out of the kitchen solemnly holding high in his hand a dish in a bowl that was the source of great hopes. The guy approached the judge and, as a sign of his respect, placed a bowl in front of him, but Po was still waiting for the noodles and was very surprised at how appetizing they looked. Darien looked closely at the dish and admitted that he had never seen anything like it before, and then asked what it was called, while the assistant was already dancing at the table, begging to try at least a piece. Before answering about the name of the dish, Ryu emphasized that perhaps he was mistaken in his guesses, but it seemed to him that Brother Po was yearning for his hometown of Guangdong. Darien had already scooped up some broth from the bowl, and the guy continued to say that he had tried to do everything possible to prepare food that would give the judge a little bit of the atmosphere of his native land. Ryu folded his hands and bowed respectfully, presenting his brother with the Guangdong fried noodles mala, although he himself knew perfectly well that it was just ordinary jampong soup. He slyly thanked his brother and took a sip of the soup. But in his head, as always, he underestimated what a master a person can really be, and began to curse the ordinary noodles of a simple innkeeper in every way possible. But after properly tasting the food prepared by a person who is a professional, Darien was taken aback, staring at the bowl of food. The judge did not understand how this could be possible, but he felt not just the taste of food, but the energy that spread throughout his body, because he felt everything that Ryu put into the dish, and we are not talking about the ingredients. The food that was in the bowl really conveyed the atmosphere of Po's native land so much that I could just imagine how, instead of food, that same beautiful coastline came to life in the bowl. Zhongwan, not expecting any sudden turn of events, simply wished bon appetit to his brother, who was no longer just eating but had pounced on the bowl with an incredible desire to eat everything clean. Darien began to stuff noodles into his mouth with such agility as if it was the last food in the whole world. And then something happened that Ryu did not expect to see at all, namely, the judge activated an incredible suction power of noodles, which was a rare occurrence, and the poor assistant should have held on tightly to something due to her tiny mass. Po really sucked in the noodles so furiously that it seemed like he was about to swallow his own face and the chopsticks he was eating with them. Jongwon continued to watch from a safe distance, but still considered such admiration for food to be beyond the pale. At some point, Po froze, stopped eating noodles, and stared straight ahead at the one who had noodles in his mouth, which was also in the judge's mouth. Everything around in the room faded, and at the table in front of Darien sat someone he initially did not recognize because he had completely forgotten what he once was. Opposite the current Po sat a young Po with noodles in his mouth and, staring at his huge version, noticed that he had changed a lot. And it wasn't just about his appearance. Young Darien clarified that in addition to his appearance, his current version has undergone changes internally, intimidating ordinary people in order to fill their own pockets. But this is not what they were aiming for. The current Po began to get nervous and make excuses that he was not going to listen to a brat who didn't understand anything about how the world works, because if his pockets are empty, he's a nobody. The current judge began to pull the wool over his eyes again, trying to get rid of the younger version of himself, continuing to humiliate him by saying that for such a naive simpleton as he, even this wool is a delicacy. But young Darien didn't say anything cruel in response, but only looked at his current version with a look full of sympathy. The big guy Po tried so hard to get rid of the kid by dragging out the noodles, but only pulled him closer to himself, and young Darien touched the face of the current one and looked at him attentively and asked if he really had such thoughts about him. While the big guy was trying to put words together into a sentence, young Po approached him, reminding him of the dream that had arisen in him then, looking at the sea. Putting his hand on the current judge's shoulder, young Po said that what he dreamed of was not the food or seafood from his hometown. And the young man, reminding the current Darien of the words about naive youth, pointed out that back then he at least dreamed of justice instead of food, after which he merged into a kiss with the big guy. Thanks to the familiar taste of the dish, Darien returned himself to himself after so many years of lies that he also ate on top. From the windows of the mansion, at the moment of the unification of the personality, the light beat with such bright rays as if an explosion of enormous scale was about to occur. When the wall of smoke cleared, the assistant and Ryu stared at where the judge was with eyes so big as if someone had actually exploded there. Po sat at the table, his head on the table, holding onto an empty bowl, and smoke was still coming from him, but he thanked the young man for the dish. When the judge raised his head, he immediately asked again what the guy had said, that the dish was called fried noodles mala, and the frightened Ryu replied that that was it, and then asked his brother if he was okay. But Darien looked completely different, and looking at his friend confirmed that everything was fine with him. It was just that the dish made him rethink a lot of things. The judge thanked the chef once again from the bottom of his heart for the food, and added that his skill was incredible in every sense. Jongwon, sweating from worry, looked at that wrong brother and did not understand at all what he had done by preparing those noodles for him. And the assistant, instead of worrying, admired out loud how cool the judge had now become, which left the guy in double shock. It was deep night, and a full moon hung in the background of the mansion, but in one of the rooms, someone was not in the mood for sleep at all and was working tirelessly. Darien sat in his office and signed all the papers that he had put off or refused to sign, and the assistant whom he had recently beaten and imprisoned cautiously brought him new scrolls. Poe unrolled one of the scrolls and addressed the assistant with the order to return all the property that they had seized, to which the worker only obediently responded with agreement, while Ryu and the assistant stood at the table in shock and anticipation. But the judge was so engrossed in his work that he didn't notice the boys, and opening another scroll, he ordered his assistant to release the man from prison and pay compensation for the damage. And finally, Darien noticed the assistant and Young Wan, asking them for forgiveness for calling them so late and also making them wait. The judge put the scrolls aside for a while and turned to the young man, asking him that things in his tavern were not going quite as he would like. The first thing the young man thought was that he couldn't get used to his new brother, but he replied that he really didn't have any visitors at all yet. Considering Ryu's modesty, he assumed that the reason for the lack of guests in the tavern was that perhaps he was a bad cook, but Poe's brother immediately noted that the guy's cooking was top-notch. After the judge complimented his brother, who was also the truth, he asked the assistant to call Mr. Cheon and Bayun into the office. Darien told the young man that he would really like to help him, while the assistant was calling Cheon and Bayun, but immediately added that now it would take him a lot of time to correct his mistakes. And when those same brave fellows appeared at the entrance, Poe introduced them to the guy as those who would help him with the tavern. One of the assistants immediately voiced that new acquaintances are always so intriguing for him, and then they unanimously asked to be allowed to introduce themselves. Ryu, turning to those with whom he would have to work shoulder to shoulder, could not yet decide what he thought, much less what to answer. Meanwhile, one of the assistants introduced himself as the Golden Hands of Cooking, Shim Uchin, whose name was Cheon, and the second introduced himself as the best connoisseur of drinks, Biyun. The guys took a strange pose, which caused even more stupor in Ryu, but the judge assured that they had no equal in the business sphere and would be very useful for advancing the business in the tavern. The men began to make some strange movements that looked rather eccentric, while calling on Ryu to get down to business. And after the assistants again froze in strange poses and made the same sounds, they promised the master that they would lead his tavern to greatness. For Young Wan, this was a crisis moment in its own way, since he now also had to get used to these two strange characters. And as always, the assistant couldn't resist putting in her 2 cents and saying that Chan and Bayun were also cool to her, to which the guy replied that there was nothing cool about it. Despite the time when many were sleeping and dreaming their 10th dream, the judge continued to work and asked the young man to make him another portion of noodles, and then Ryu realized why Poe had actually called him. In the morning, a strange team of 4 members, including Ryu, walked through the forest that was located among the mountains towards the friendly night tavern. When the guys were getting closer to the tavern, Biyun, looking ahead, asked Master Ryu if the house ahead was really friendly night, and Chen added that the premises looked more decent than he had imagined. The newly minted assistants immediately began commenting on the location of the tavern, indicating that although it was located in the backyard, it was close to the road, and Chen admired the fact that there were rooms for guests. Chen wondered out loud why the tavern's business was so poor then, and at that moment Biyun stared at something and began to gag, already automatically answering his partner's question. When Biyun was finally able to take a breath of air, he screamed as loudly as he could, and his partner picked up the scream and fell to the ground, while the assistant and Ryu looked at the guys and didn't understand what was going on. The guy scratched the back of his head and hesitantly asked what was wrong with his tavern, and he thought to himself, why the hell is this man yelling like that? The assistants almost in one voice shouted why this horror was hanging here and showed the owner the lanterns that were hanging at the entrance. The demon hater took off one of the lanterns and approached the boys, and the unfortunate ones hugged each other out of fear, screaming hysterically for the little one to take this abomination away from them and not come closer. Ryu, sincerely not understanding what was wrong with the lantern, thought that maybe it was possessed by a ghost or a curse. So to be on the safe side, he asked his assistants what was wrong with this element of the tavern. While the assistant, despite the request not to come closer, continued to mock the guys, scaring them with a flashlight. Chen called the master an idiot, arguing that no one would ever come to him with such flashlights. But Chen voiced not only criticism, but also explained that in order to show that the place is open, you need to hang a lantern made of gardenia. But this horror that was hanging meant that the place was closed. Poor Zhongwan stood in a stupor as if he had been doused with ice water. And the most offensive thing about all this was that, without real knowledge, he had been without clients for so long. Analyzing what happened, the guy realized that after reincarnation, all he has are the memories of the young man Ryu Chongwan, who was originally the owner of the body. The only problem was that the young man Ryu had no talent and only dreamed of becoming a martial arts master. And if we take the business side, then in this part of Ryu Chongwan's life there was generally a wasteland through which tumbleweeds flew every now and then in the form of fantasies about how he destroyed enemies, but in other respects the young man, unfortunately, was talentless. Chen carried Biyun inside, complaining that they had only just started working, and he already wanted to run away from here, while Ryu was thinking that even if he had been reborn, then couldn't they have stuffed him into a smarter body with many more abilities? But the assistant still agreed to inspect the premises and inside, so the whole team went to the middle, and from behind the bushes of the forest that was in front of the tavern, at that moment someone was watching them. The stranger, completely covered in clothes so that she would be less noticeable, was very nervous about getting ready for another attempt to do what she had already wanted more than once. Meanwhile, the assistants began to dance their strange dances again, scattering a sea of scrolls and enticing the master to fill out the necessary papers. Ryu plunged into monotonous work, while the annoying Chen buzzed in his ear, reminding the master to prepare documents for the tax report, and Bayun agreed that paying taxes was the main duty of every inhabitant of the Middle Lands. The guy had the impression that the scrolls never ended, and the assistants continued to throw him new tasks in the form of obtaining permission to sell alcohol. And Ryu was already praying for all this to end quickly so that they could begin the main process. Chen, with a very thoughtful look, said out loud that it seemed like they were missing something else important. Ryu wasn't distracted by Chen's remark and continued filling out the paperwork, but Bayun said that there was something they really hadn't noticed. Both assistants stared at the demon hater, who was also quite eccentric and was tearing up one of the scrolls at that moment. So Byun noted that there was a strange dog in the tavern. Byun also noted, turning towards Zhongwan, that they also had a master who was the owner and the boss in one person. And then the assistants began to deliberately pretend that they were looking for someone and reacted vividly and feignedly that those they were looking for were nowhere to be found. Terribly exhausted, Chen and Byun finally stopped searching, admitting that the tavern was indeed empty, and there were only them, the master, and a strange little dog there. The performance continued, and now, having changed their facial expressions, the guys became cunning like foxes, indicating that since everything turned out exactly this way, they had no choice. Ryu just approached his assistants with the good news that he had finished filling out the paperwork and could now go to the kitchen, but Chen and Byun had other plans for this. Having snatched the signed scrolls from the master, the guys solemnly announced that they would now behold the highlight of the restaurant business and the face of any tavern. There was not enough of a drum roll before the assistants announced that the selection of waiters was to begin and asked the candidates to enter the tavern. Somehow, Young Wan found himself at the table among the assistants and the hater as a judge and could not figure out how this happened and when he missed this moment. While Ryu was gathering himself together, Chen had already asked the first candidate to come out to them and demonstrate his skills. The master came to his senses and was already able to adequately assess the situation, admitting that if things went well, they could indeed take one waiter. Chen announced to the guy who came out to perform first that he could begin demonstrating his abilities, and he cleared his throat and began his performance rather strangely. The young man began to read a rhymed text about the chef Ryu and how he fried duck necks in a hot sauce with vegetables, and after eating the dish, chi energy would beat. Ryu almost had a heart attack from this, but the hapless musician waiter decided to finish him off completely, and read out more lines about how if the visitor didn't give him the money, he would get punched in the face. The young man tried so hard that on the last verse about how, if you don't like the noodles, then it's better to get out of the tavern, he bit his tongue until it bled. Chen, as always in his affected manner, put his hand to his head and exclaimed, "What an expressive performance this is." But alas, such an attitude towards visitors is unacceptable. The guy stood there with blood coming out of his mouth, and Chen, Byun, and the assistant simultaneously showed him the exit, saying that he was disqualified. Chung Wan, unable to stand this nonsense, asked to take any of the waiters, which caused indignation in Chen, but he continued to say that they did not need an artist, but a working person. Here Bion entered the conversation, sharply shouting at the master that he was again with his bad taste, and the hater supported this by simply shouting at the guy, which both of them really scared Ryu. And now Bion, like a good boy, began to explain in a calm voice that the waiter's voice is the soul of the tavern, and his ability to eloquently greet and serve visitors reflects the atmosphere of the establishment, and the assistant again agreed. Byun started shouting again, asking if he now understood why people were being selected, and of course, Ryu, scared to death, answered that he understood everything, but in fact no, he answered because the assistant looked scary. Chen was glad that his rude partner managed to calm down the overly smart master and announced to the other candidates that they could continue. At that moment, instead of the sounds of cooking in the kitchen, the sounds of singing were heard from the tavern. But all the judges except Chong Wan were enjoying this circus, and in the end Chong gave a 9 and Byun a 7, and the hater even demanded noodles. Ryu wanted to move somewhere from here because it was terribly difficult for a person who was burning with the cooking process to endure something like that. The performance continued, and the assistant ate her noodles, and in the end it all came down to a fight, and looked more like a madhouse than a selection of waiters. It is unknown where Ryu got his composure from, but at one point he simply quietly said the word enough, despite the noise going on around him. But everyone was too carried away by the performance, so to reinforce his decision, the master stood up from the table and hitting it with his hands, he shouted to stop this unknown horror. When everyone fell silent, the guy immediately outlined his boundaries and the boundaries of what was permitted in the room, pointing out that his tavern was not the place for such obscurantism. The master reminded his assistants that his establishment was intended for people to take a break from the road and enjoy delicious food. Finally, Ryu added that it was enough for him that his tavern already had everything necessary to cover the basic needs of the guests, so he made the verdict that they did not need a waiter. Having saddened both the participants and the other judges with his decision, Zhongwan stood and waited for the unfortunate waiters to leave so that he could continue to properly run the tavern. But the assistants and the strange dog began to whisper that the master was some kind of extremely eccentric and generally abnormal, and the hater, as always, added that he was also a pervert, and Ryu heard all this. Despite everything that the young man had experienced and endured today, he said that he would still like to continue working, even without a waiter. But like a bolt from the blue, the door suddenly opened, and the one who had been watching the team in the bushes ran in, shouting a request to wait and not finish the selection. Chen grimaced as if he saw a pile of manure, indignant that it was that person again, and Byun could not believe that the girl was so persistent since she had been following them all this time. The young lady, having come such a long way, fell on her knees begging everyone to give her a chance to take part in the selection of waiters. Chen approached the girl and haughtily reminded her that she herself had spoken about her low status and lack of talent, which is why she had no chance of working here. The girl in desperation took off her hood and introduced herself as Chu Garin, promising that she would give it her all, which horrified Chen even more, threatening that he might refuse her. And besides, they hadn't opened up yet. Chen continued to point out to the girl with the same dismissive tone that there were no waiters as dark and plump as she was, but Chu begged for one chance. The assistant could no longer watch this unfortunate scene, so he turned away, expressing another compelling argument that the master had personally said that they did not hire waiters, and then Chongwon's hand fell on Chen's shoulder. Ryu came up and said right away that he was hiring the girl without even asking her anything. And when Chen wanted to remind the master about what he said 5 minutes ago about the previous candidates, the guy mentioned that the final word was his as the owner. Chen wanted to object again, but this had already pissed Ryu off so much that he started shouting and waving his arms, explaining that it didn't matter what he had said before because right now he was hiring a girl for a job. The poor thing cried with happiness and thanked the master for his generosity, but still sat on her knees on the floor. Jongwon was embarrassed by the fact that Chu called him master and said that it was too much, but in fact he was not against such treatment. And then the assistant saw confirmation of the dog's words that the guy really was a pervert. Chu laughed at the young man's reaction and said that from now on she would only call him master, adding a double dose of awkwardness to the situation. When the Friendly Night Tavern team was replenished with waitress Chu Garin, it was time to think about opening the establishment. So the demon hater took on the task of removing all the creepy lanterns. Jongwon decided to give Chu an advance payment in silver ingot, which almost made the girl go crazy, and the guy immediately asked her to tell him if that was really not the custom here. But the girl, of course, said that everything was fine, and was so impressed that she fell to the floor in front of the master thanks to his generosity, and Ryu immediately asked her to get up and not make up nonsense. The owner, seeing how desperate the girl was, decided to pay her a month in advance, and the poor thing burst into tears, deciding that she would dedicate her whole life to this. And Chen was terribly bored with such a boring master, so he suggested changing the decor and furniture, asking if their finances allowed it. The hater continued to hang the correct lanterns, thus completing the final touches to prepare the tavern for opening. All that was left was to wait for what Ryu had been working towards for so long, both in his past life and in his present life, namely, when the bell on the front door would ring, and that moment had arrived. Both the master and the waitress reacted to the sound, realizing that the long-awaited first client had finally arrived. Chu had already hurried to the entrance, holding a tray with dishes and cutlery to greet the visitor and place him in the hall for further service. It would seem that nothing could go wrong, but it is precisely at such moments that trouble appears as suddenly as a lightning strike that kills instantly. This is exactly what the first guest was like when he entered the tavern for the second time. Seeing the visitor because of whom the previous tavern was completely destroyed, something inside Ryu seemed to fall down very loudly and break, and apparently it was a heart. And the warrior who had already been in the Friendly Night, leaving behind him the destruction, corpses and blood, calmly looked around and said that now the eatery finally looked like a real tavern, and the guy just prayed in his head that this horror would simply go away from here. Since Chu didn't know who the visitor was specifically for the owner, she said welcome to him, and the assistants just stood aside and stared at the stranger. But Ryu, the poor guy, seemed to have already given up his soul to God. And it would have been better if the guy hadn't really seen how a row of fighters just like him appeared behind the warrior with a scar on his face. And the same story happened with the fighters in yellow suits, who were almost all killed here last time. Poor Ryu began to rub his eyes because he thought he had gone crazy, and against the backdrop of the previous defeat, he was now imagining more fighters on a nervous basis. But there really were two gang leaders at the table, and each had 4 fighters who, as if from a carbon copy, laid out 3 iambs of silver and knives each this time. Chu, still not understanding anything, already wanted to go and take the guest's orders, but Jongwon had already grabbed her and, covering her mouth, dragged her in the other direction. The guy hid behind the table with the girl, quietly telling her that these were not visitors, which made Chen and Byun's knees tremble. The owner continued to explain that if a suspicious traveler puts 3 iambs of silver in his blade on the table, then this is a very bad sign in Murim, and the leaders have already really started a squabble, but so far only in words. Hearing how the leaders had already started to bicker, Ryu warned everyone that the tavern would soon turn into a battlefield for them, which is the basic law of the combat world. The master's entire team had already crawled up to the table while Chongwan watched the fighters' behavior from his ambush. Chen asked that, judging by the owner's words, such a massacre was not happening for the first time, and Ryu confirmed his words, pointing out that on the day the old tavern opened, everything there was broken to pieces. Judging by the way the leaders addressed each other, the bandits in yellow clothes were from the Red Blood, and those who came with the man in dark clothes were called the Black Forest. And while they were snapping at each other, the guy sincerely did not understand why they came here again. Assistant Chen only escalated the situation by saying that he did not want to upset the master, but if this invasion was repeated a second time, then now his tavern is a battlefield for them and they don't care about food. And the hater, picking up on this, said that she was already really hungry. For thugs like these fighters, taste really didn't matter at all, and the leader of the Red Bloods walked up to the table and shouted that it was time to stop with the empty chatter, and turned over the table on which lay both weapons and money. Ryu, hearing the ringing of blades and money, turned around with an anxious thought that it had already begun, and Chen confirmed his words, saying that these guys liked the taste of fists and swords. And unfortunately, whether by will or by force of fate, It turned out that it was the Friendly Night Tavern that was chosen to become the site of the eternal battle of these fighters. While the young man was crying bitter tears, which had just begun to work out more and more, those ghouls, the assistant dog, came to him again and shouted even more furiously that she was hungry. The fighting in the hall was already in full swing, and one could clearly hear the clanging of blades, the falling of furniture, and the breaking of bones. Chen sadly told the owner that once his tavern became famous, it would be finished immediately, and after finishing his funeral speech, Bayun called his friend into the barrel. The oil painting looked like there was a massacre in the hall, and the assistants hid in a barrel asking to call them when it was all over. At the same time, the hater jumped on top of the barrel and screamed like a beast about her hunger, and Chu fiercely declared that she would not tolerate such treatment of the master. The one with the most determination was the dog assistant, who literally charged into the crowd of armed idiots, shouting that she wasn't going to tolerate it any longer. Well, Chu, as expected of a non-warlike girl, unlike a hater, had to cover the master from the threat, not with her chest, but with her back. But she covered Ryu himself with her chest, declaring that she would protect him at the cost of her life. But the guy's life was more at risk while the girl was holding him close to her because he began to choke, and blades continued to ring in the hall and screams could be heard. One of the hatchets that the fighter had knocked off the enemy just flew towards Chu and Ryu, and when the girl saw it, she did something that almost made the master move his horse. The waitress defended herself so cleverly using the owner as a shield that if only a little more had happened, one Zhongwan would have become two. When Ryu caught his breath and realized what had happened, he thought that it would be better if he really died than to see how a hatchet crashed into the floor a couple of centimeters from him. Ryu, nervous, turned to Chu and yelled at her, reminding her that she was ready to protect him at the cost of her life, to which the girl burst into tears and said that she was scared, and added that if the master suddenly died, she would take care of his body. The conversation between the boy and the girl was interrupted by a warrior from the Black Forest gang, who landed on his back on the table, causing Chu to scream and Ryu to say that it was time for them to get out of here. The master headed for the exit, shouting to the waitress to hurry up, but the girl, while running, was looking back to make sure that no weapons were flying in their direction again. Surprisingly, today not only robbers wanted to visit the tavern because on their way, a very beautiful girl in the company of guards was approaching the entrance. The moment when Ryu ran out of the door coincided with the girl and the guards, on the contrary, wanting to go inside, and the master ran into the young lady. The first thing that Chongwan thought was surprise from yet another visitor, and he breathed a sigh of relief that he braked in time and did not collide with her. But Chu was running behind, not even looking ahead, and it turned out that Ryu ended up running into two girls at once and was sandwiched between them in the most awkward way. For the entire day, the young man probably felt comfortable for the first time for a moment, and if things continued like this, he would no longer need this tavern or the business. But for a moment, that's why the stranger grabbed the guy by his beautiful bangs, addressing him as a weirdo while Chu looked at the one she collided with. The beautiful guest, continuing to hold Ryu by the hair, asked if the idiot had prepared his last wish before his death. Chongwan was already not understanding anything, so he really didn't answer anything, and the stranger said that she was terribly sorry, but since she had come here on important business, she would have to kill the guy quickly, and then Chu, asking to let the master go, saved his life. The stranger looked at the half-dead man and asked the girl again if this was Master Ryu Chongwan, the owner of the tavern, to which he could barely answer that it was him, and the young lady already wanted to say something else but did not have time. The doors of the tavern collapsed to the ground right in front of the unknown lady, and along with the doors, the red blood fighter also fell to the ground. The stranger irritably walked into the thick of things, continuing to hold Ryu by the hair, and the guys who were following her had already prepared their weapons. As soon as this lady said who she wanted to deal with first and pointed with her hand where to aim, the guards behind her already started using their weapons. The knives, at a precise angle of 90 degrees, plunged into the table in huge numbers, and at the same time began to sparkle strangely and release smoke. The next second, such a powerful explosion occurred in the tavern that the table shattered into pieces like a toy. The smoke screen went away, and you could see the demon hater knocking out one of the red bloods, and the gang leaders fighting in front of her, and after such an explosion, it was hard not to notice the girl at the entrance. The lady, with a grin, indicated to everyone who was still intact that it was too noisy for such small fry as they, and warned that if they wanted to live a little longer, it would be better to disappear from her sight right now. The main gang members froze in shock from the statement of some young lady crossing their arms, but the girl again pointed out that she had important business in this tavern. The leader of the Red Blood called the stranger crazy and asked if she couldn't see who was standing in front of her. But the leader of the Black Forest chose not to move and remained silent because he understood who was standing in front of him. The chicken decided to show off by pointing out to the girl that she was too old for this kind of activity and told her that she should go look for a man, and then the enemy asked his enemy to shut up. The head of the Red Blood continued to grumble discontentedly about women who stick their noses into men's affairs, and at that moment a needle flies into his hand, piercing it right through. The stranger, who had such a refined weapon in reserve, bared her smile and asked the scoundrel how he dared to say something like that with his dirty tongue while on the lands of the Tang sect. It was then that the head of the Black Forest came to his senses that these snake eyes and evil character belonged only to one person from the Tang sect. In front of the blockheads was the daughter of the Tang sect leader, the poisonous butterfly Tang Yongyong. Yellowbeak looked closely at the hand that was pierced through and also refreshed his memory with this, realizing that the weapon was poisoned. But the assistant dog, having climbed onto the face of one of the Red Bloods, shouted to the lady that she was glad to see her. The poison of the needle was so strong and fast-acting that the leader's hand became covered in a very sickly color, and he stopped feeling it, which indicated that if the poison got into the heart, he would die from paralysis. Yon Yon now asked the greenhorn to repeat what he had told her, but he was too busy panicking, and the girl continued to explain that it makes no difference to the poison whether it hits a man or a woman. The head of the Black Forest decided to inquire how his opponent was feeling and suggested finishing the duel another time, but at that very moment this idiot, panicking and not feeling his hand, shook it and stuck a needle right into his opponent's eye. And now, two poor fellows have started screaming because one of them is losing his arm, and the other has now irretrievably lost an eye, and it would be good if it was only the eye, because the needle could have reached the brain. From the tavern came the cries of the would-be duelists that it was really time for them to run away, but they would still have time to finish their fun. All this time, Yon Yon had been holding the hair of the neither alive nor dead Ryu, and now she raised him in front of her again, noting to herself that now everything was settled. But because of such a commotion, she was hungry. The girl voiced her desire to taste the master's fried noodles before they got down to business, for which they had originally come. Naturally, when there is a threat to life, not only will the noodles be cooked, but in general, any process will go faster and more quickly. So the master immediately began preparing the food. Only this time Ryu cooked not with inspiration but under duress and with anxious thoughts about whether he would live or not. The guy's thoughts were only occupied with the adventures of Yong, and the Tang sect in the Middle Lands was considered professional in terms of poisons and killing techniques, which is why it was considered the greatest Marima sect in Sichuan. The young man also took into account an even more dangerous individual, and this was Patriarch Tang and the ruler of poison Tang Ji-won, who had an only daughter, Yon, and she could not help but adopt her father's skill. All these thoughts gave the master goosebumps despite the hot cooking process, and he wondered why the girl came, but at the same time, the consolation and hope for survival for the cook were the noodles that Yong would try and perhaps leave. The moment X arrived, and Chu brought out a bowl of noodles for the guest, announcing that the tavern's signature dish for the lady was ready. Chu was terribly nervous, but added that noodles with black bean sauce had been prepared for the lady, and to Yon's surprise, she had already said that it smelled delicious and looked pretty good, and the poor assistant who was being held by the guards suffered from the desire to try a piece. Zhongwan noticed that the girl was holding both the bowl and the chopsticks in a strange way, and a silent question was immediately visible on her face. Ryu still wondered out loud, but very quietly, why Yong was using chopsticks so strangely, and unexpectedly received an answer from somewhere that the young master was illiterate. Chen opened the lid of the barrel in which he and Biyun were still sitting, and once again pointed out to the guy his lack of education and stupidity. But as always after criticism, the assistant explained to the master that the way the girl touches cutlery and dishes is a distinctive feature and habit of the entire Tang family, because the middle and index fingers carry poison. Now the young man understood not only why the girl was eating like that, but also that he should have been twice as careful with her. And finally Chen said that if the master had any questions, he knew where to find him and hid because a guard approached the barrel. The poor assistant was again wrapped up like a caterpillar, and her mouth was covered with tape. And in the meantime, Yan said that the smell is of course good, but the structure of the dish is also important, without which the food tastes like dog food. The girl's words only gave Ryu confidence, because Yong's taste turned out to be more refined than the master expected. But this was a plus, since the guy knew that he was cooking at a high level. Zhongwan knew his advantage because, unlike his noodles, dried noodles were used everywhere at that time, which were made from thin dough that was oiled and cut into noodles before drying. The guy remembered from his previous life that if you were looking for noodles like in the medieval world but in modern life, it would be Japanese Okinawa soba. But in the past, there was no choice because you either eat non-chewable noodles or hate them. But the master's confidence in his dishes was already there because the noodles that he served to the guests were completely different since he made them himself. Before cooking, the young man mixed fresh dough with his own hands, which he then stretched into noodles. Ryu used a method of making noodles that would not be developed for another 500 years and was first mentioned by the writer Min Sun Ho in his health notes dating back to 1504. Therefore, for people who tried Ryu Chongwan's noodles and felt the delight of elasticity and pleasant chewing, it was like getting a rare artifact. The proof that the noodles made by the master were truly completely different was the expression on the faces of everyone who tried them, and Yan was no exception. The way the noodles were stretched by hand and the chef monitored their texture was a novelty for people of that era. Yang began to slurp up the noodles so intensely that the guard was already afraid for his mistress, asking if everything was okay, but she didn't answer because she couldn't tear herself away from the dish. By stretching the noodles into ever smaller ropes, Ryu created waves akin to the sea or ocean and looked like a god who was able to conquer this process. Yan had a lot of questions about the noodles, but there was no time to ask them, because if you try it once, you won't be able to stop, and the pleasure was so great that the girl's facial muscles cramped. This reaction was not without reason, because in addition to freshly kneaded noodles, the master added sweet tianmian bean sauce. Yan couldn't even sit anymore. She was so taken over by the taste of the food. So she stood up and continued to devour the noodles, tasting the spices and other ingredients. Zhongwan was like the master of the noodles. With each reduction and approach to cooking, he knew that when Yan tried it with the sauce, it would be the best thing she had ever eaten. And as they say, as you name the ship, so it will sail. When Yan finished her noodles, she was happy and full as never before in her life, which again could be read on her face. The noodles knocked the lady out cold, both literally and figuratively, and Yan plopped face down on the table next to the bowl, causing the guards to immediately come running and ask if everything was okay. Ryu also almost went crazy because the first thing he thought was that the lady also had some kind of allergic reaction like Chan once had from nuts. The master himself had already run up to the table and also began to ask what had happened to the lady. But Yan slowly began to rise, breathing heavily and sweating profusely, which frightened the guy. And then Yan smiled slyly and, rising even higher, cursed the young man and grabbed him by the clothes, which now made Chu horrified, thinking that the young lady would give the master another beating. But the butterfly, continuing to hold Ryu by the clothes, raised her face to him with a burning blush on her cheeks and said that what had just happened to her was not bad. Yan remembered the words of Zhong, who assured her sister that the guy was an excellent cook. And now that she had personally tasted the master's cooking, she was no longer surprised that her sister had fallen in love with him. While Yan was thinking all this, Ryu reached out to her with his hand to feel her pulse on her neck, from which the young lady was horrified, completely not knowing what he wanted to do. The young man looked closely at the butterfly and asked if she was sure that she really felt well, which made her even more taken aback. Zhongwan managed to feel his pulse and realized that it was indeed normal before Yan asked him in horror what he was even thinking and moved away from him. The master managed to conclude that the lady's temperature had risen, but immediately after that a scroll flew into his face. And Ryu got hit in the face so hard that the table broke in half. But if Yan screamed furiously that the guy was a pervert, which was very strange because usually his hater does this, then Chu cried, afraid for the master. Yan's cheeks turned even pinker, and inside her the sharpness of the noodles, anger, and embarrassment from the young man's touch merged together, and the butterfly shouted at this idiot to watch his hands. When Zhongwan crawled out from under the rubble of the table with his neck twisted, he also got hit on the head with a scroll that Yan threw at him, shouting that if he hadn't been connected to Chagall, she would have killed him a long time ago. The assistant dog barked at Cheon and Beyond to get their attention, and when their heads emerged from the barrel, they first looked at the baby and then at the scroll with the Chigall seal. The fact that the assistants paid attention to the seal made Yan wake up from her anger and remember that before the guy distracted her with noodles and pissed her off with his behavior, Uncle Chiggle asked her to pass on the letter to Ryu. While poor Chu looked at the master's twisted neck with horror, the young man himself, hearing the word uncle, did not want to believe that this wild woman was also in Guanxi with Mr. Chong, but this explains what she knew about his noodles. The assistants began to read a letter from Cheon, in which the gentleman said that soon the elder of the clan, Tan B. Ryan, would celebrate his 80th birthday, and then Yon interrupted them, surprised that the old man still needed celebrations at such an age. And Ryu had already imagined a picture of how 3 generations of a poisonous sect would come together in one place and somehow no longer wanted to get closer to Chigo. But the guys continued to read the letter where Chan explained that, unfortunately, he would have to miss the important event due to certain circumstances. When the assistant read the last lines where it was said that the master asks Ryu to attend the anniversary on his behalf, Chu straightened the master's neck and the guy's eyes widened, but it is not clear whether it was more from the shock that he had to go or from the straightening of his neck. A butterfly approached Chongwan and asked if he understood, but without even waiting for an answer, she told him not to hesitate and get ready to go and accordingly be there as soon as possible. When Yon said that they were going to the lands of the Tang clan, which are called Chengdu, the most terrible picture he could imagine appeared in the guy's head. But Chengdu was actually the heart of Sichuan and the stronghold of the Tang clan, and visually, it did not at all match the macabre visions of the Ryu. From his past life, the guy already knew that he was heading to the legendary lands created by Emperor Liu Bei, namely the capital of Shu Han. The young man, loaded like a mule, walked and thought about how, being a fan of the 3 kingdoms and Chega Liang in his previous life, he wanted to visit these lands someday. And while the poor fellow was dragging a bunch of stuff on himself, the young lady savored the rings that the master had also made before setting off on the road. But there was one snag in the fact that the guy was now going to meet his dream of visiting the lands of Chengdu, and it was that he did not plan to do this as a slave. And on top of that, a dog had settled down, shouting that the pervert was a good guy who had made such a delicious treat. Yan told the guy to give her another treat, but Zhongwan refused, explaining that it was not just a snack, but an emergency ration, since she herself had indicated that they would be on the road for 2 weeks. The butterfly reined in the guy using her usual method of grabbing him by the hair and threateningly repeated her request, also pointing out that he should stop whining. And here, the master already regretted that he made the snack so tasty, because initially it was conceived as a rice cake that once served as rations for soldiers, and accordingly, tasted terrible. But he was a master of culinary arts on the road, so he changed the recipe, and instead of rice flour, he used wheat flour, eggs, and milk, and then made a ring out of the resulting dough and fried it in oil, resulting in a donut. Although this product was already radically different from rice cakes, Ryu decided to bring the donut version to the most popular version in the whole world, covering it with melted sugar on top and getting a glazed donut. Well, of course, when everyone tried the new product, which was different from the stone and bland rice cake, their taste buds flew into space with pleasure. It turned out good and not so good at the same time, because when preparing such a delicious treat, the master did not take into account that the donuts would be too tasty, which is why they were eaten right away. But it wasn't just the donuts he ate that were enough, and the young man carried an even heavier burden than the one he had on his shoulders, in the form of worry for his tavern. Ryu left his brainchild with 3 assistants of a slightly dubious character, and even when the guy was tied up and carried away, the assistants never got out of the barrel, and Chu, instead of shedding tears for the master as usual, smiled and waved. In the midst of all this mess of thoughts, the voice of the hater reached Zhongwan, who slapped him on the head, called him a pervert, and asked him to hurry up. The sun was setting over the horizon, to which the dog reacted brightly by shouting to everyone that it was already sunset. But the only thing the tortured Ryu was thinking about now was the question of when he would just go about his business with a clear conscience. The same full moon was shining in the sky as when Ryu was reborn into this world, and the team also organized a halt by the stream, and water for dinner was already boiling in the cauldron. Poor Zhongwan was now laying out what he had been carrying the entire way, and the assistant continued to hate the demon with all her soul and pointed him to the right and to the left. Even when on the road, the guy turned to the mountains of muscles in the form of bodyguards with a request to take something from his hand luggage, they denied it, saying that they had to be agile and ready for any dangerous situation. And now, when Ryu again turned to the thugs to help set up camp, these idiots pretended that a deer had passed by somewhere in the distance, hoping that they would still escape. While setting up the cover, Chongwan was already quite irritated by the fact that he also had to cook for the whole crowd, and this was unpleasant considering the fact that he was the only one tired among them all. But to Ryu's great surprise, he turned to the sound of stirring the liquid in the cauldron, and there stood Mrs. Yong, just as the hater swung the whip at him, screaming for the pervert not to get distracted, and the whip passed the guy's face. The master approached the butterfly and asked if it was soup, to which she indifferently replied that it was, and asked if the guy wanted to try it. While distributing soup to those who wanted it, the girl made a lyrical digression in the form of a mention of her grandfather, who constantly grumbles about the need for his granddaughter to learn to cook before getting married. Yon ended this short story about the family dilemma by noting Ryu's skill and therefore wanted to know his verdict on the soup, and at that very moment, as if by Murphy's Law, the guy started coughing. Jongwon grabbed his cheek and dropped the bowl, falling to the ground, experiencing a terrible toothache, comparing it to biting a stone. The master immediately broke out in sweat, remembering that the food was cooked by a representative of the Tang clan, which is famous for its killing techniques and poisons, and was already ready to die. Ryu imagined this terrible picture of how Yon, remembering everything her grandfather taught her, cooked a soup that at first you wouldn't even know was poisonous. But the lady brought Chongwan down to earth, surprised at how he was screaming, and reassured him that he had come across an ordinary stone and did not understand at all why he had bitten it. Yon, in all seriousness and surprise, asked if Ryu had never heard of or tried a stew made from stones that had to be removed and then eaten, and the hater even teased that if you chewed it thoroughly, nothing terrible would happen. Dripping with sweat and drooling from his toothache, the guy finally remembered the savagery that was inherent to people of those times at first glance. But the method of preparing the soup was not due to the wildness of the people, but had an adequate explanation because the stew was cooked from stones that were covered with seaweed similar to kelp, and in a previous life the cook had only seen this in old cookbooks. Until Ryu turned to the butterfly, excitement flashed across her face which she could not hide, asking the master if he liked the soup. In order not to offend the lady and not die on the spot, instead of lying that it was delicious, Chongwan asked to give him a minute and grabbed the folded structure. The structure in the hands of the young man began to understand the words to the assistant to prepare the wok and seasonings for number 3 with carrots and eggs. The demon hater immediately accepted the task and prepared everything necessary. And when Yon asked her what this number 3 was, the assistant said that she herself did not really understand. Everything needed for cooking, including food and kitchen utensils, rose into the air and looked like chaos that was about to fall and break. But the structure that was previously unfolded has now become a table on which everything that was previously thrown onto the table has become as if it was there originally, including the knives. Yon stared at this seemingly circus with Ryu as the main performer, but inside she was overcome with a mesmerizing feeling. Meanwhile, the master continued to create, commenting that first the moss is separated from the stones, and in order to remove its earthy taste, salt and pepper are needed, and to make it pleasant to chew, noodles and other additives must be added. And then the butterfly noticed that when Ryu cooked, it was as if he became a completely different person, but she immediately pulled herself away from these thoughts, calling him an impudent idiot, and the hater growled again that she was hungry. Sparks rose into the sky as if they were reaching for the moon, and the assistant kept shouting at the pervert to cook faster so that her death from hunger would not hang on his conscience. Saying that the dish was now ready to eat, the master served the girls food and introduced them to the visitors as noodles with stone broth and seaweed. Yon asked with a dissatisfied face if the young man had simply added noodles to her soup, but she began tasting it while the assistant, as if she really were a dog, simply dipped her face into the bowl. Having felt in her mouth the full taste and richness of the corrected soup, the girl was again surprised at how the master was able to do something similar here. Yon commented that the taste had actually changed and become much better than it was initially, but she didn't understand how the guy managed to do it. The lady was angry, but only because she didn't understand. So she pressed Ryu to confess what he did with the soup and what secret ingredient he added to it. Zhongwan scratched his head and gave an almost truthful answer that he didn't add anything like that, but only made the dish more harmonious with the help of seasonings. Yon almost choked on her noodles when the master added that he had added fried carrots and omelet to the noodles especially for her, so that the texture of the dish would be brighter. With a thoughtful expression, the young man stated the fact that the rest of the dish was practically no different from what Yon had cooked. Ryu turned back to his table, And the butterfly continued to insist that she didn't believe in all these tricks that changed the taste so much, because even the best chefs in her house couldn't do that. Yon flashed her sly smile and threatened the young man with her finger, so that he would already tell the whole truth and not lie about the secret. But the master calmly answered Mrs. Tang that cooking is about effort and dedication, which entails the goal of understanding the guest's tastes and thereby penetrating his heart, and this can be done by turning simple ingredients into a wonderful dish. Such speeches made the jaw of such a strong-willed young lady drop, and everything indicated that she, too, had fallen in love with the guy, but she didn't realize it yet or didn't want to admit it. Ryu was just hiding under his clothes, that very important element of his skill in this world, in the form of a bag of sodium glutamate, exhaling that he almost burned out. And while the guy was hiding the secret of his unique taste, Yan was approaching him from behind with her hand already outstretched to grab him. The girl grabbed Youngwon's clothes tightly and turned him towards her, causing a look of quiet horror to appear on his face. The lady bit her lip from an excess of feelings and sternly told the master to stop behaving so impudently, to which he could only apologize and add that glutamate is harmless. Ryu once again prepared himself for the fact that he would be killed now. But in fact, the girl really wanted to kiss the young man and was already reaching out to him with her lips, and the poor guy did nothing but ask for forgiveness. All these screams and squeals were noticed by the dog, who finally finished eating the noodles and was distracted from such an important process, looking towards the mistress and the master, and on her forehead was written the question of what she missed. Suddenly, one of the bodyguards appeared in the clearing, and it was so sudden that Yon covered the guy's face with a bowl, burning with shame and awkwardness. The bodyguard was breathing with difficulty and standing on his feet, but he came running to warn his mistress about something, and judging by his appearance, it was about danger. Yon, thinking that the bodyguard noticed her and the guy together, blushed and shouted that they were not doing anything like that. But the thug didn't mean that at all, and told her to run away from there as quickly as possible. But it was already late, and someone rather tall, at whom the dog looked like a mountain, broke Chongwon's table with his foot and asked with surprise what the guests were doing in this area. While Ryu still couldn't remove the bowl from his face, a huge cabinet, with an equally huge sword, wanted to know what such a refined person from the Sichuan Tang clan was doing in the Green Forest. Yan wasn't exactly scared, but she definitely didn't expect to see the gang leader here, so she couldn't think of anything to answer at first. And so the big guy asked again what brought the lady to these parts. The bowl still didn't want to leave poor Ryu's face, and the butterfly finally came to its senses that in front of it was Cheju Ibu himself from the Green Forest, which meant the leader of the wild plants of the forest. Chongwon was able to breathe again, but he still didn't see who was standing in front of them, and in the meantime, the leader was not alone here, as it turned out, but with his brothers who brought bodyguards. Now the master was looking at the pile of muscles and, thanks to his knowledge, remembered that in the Middle Lands, there were once 72 bases for local gangs, one of which was the Green Forest. These guys were considered a great alliance of bandits in these lands, despite the fact that they did not practice martial arts or other teachings. Due to the fact that the number of thugs was high, and each of them had incredible physical training, no one could even think of them as a gang of robbers, and even famous martial artists feared them. The leader got bored because there was silence, and lowering the sword which was higher than she was, almost in front of the girl's nose, he asked why she was silent. The muscle-bound man knew who this young lady was, but he couldn't stop looking at her, which looked creepy from the outside. But in fact, the leader was puzzled by the question of what brought the girl here, and from the outside it seemed to him that he did not look as frightening as others saw him from the outside. Before meeting Yan a few days ago, the leader was sitting in the bandits' camp and grieving because he really wanted to meet the girl and talk to her, and if he was lucky, even become friends. Cheju sat at the table sipping his drink and abruptly slammed his cup on the table, feeling irritated because he didn't know what steps to take to find himself a girlfriend. The leader decided to eat away his stress with an appetizing chicken leg, while complaining to his colleague who was sitting opposite him that he was fed up with everything and that he didn't even have anyone to ask for advice, to which his friend readily agreed. The situation was also aggravated by the fact that the man had lived among only men for quite a long time, which is why girls seemed complicated to him and, as a result, unattainable. But his friend consoled the boss that they had recently had a new guy. A friend called the newcomer over and introduced him to the leader as someone who knows a lot about girls, and the newcomer introduced himself as Choi Jong, And the boss immediately threw him a compliment that girls probably throw themselves at such a cutie, which made him embarrassed. Zhang did not hesitate and immediately explained to the leader that it was important to start by talking to the girl, which surprised him, and the guy continued that the conversation would go easily if you started with the most ordinary questions. The thugs crowded around the new guy, praising his knowledge and wondering where he knew so much from, and Zhang decided to add one more important piece of advice. The newcomer advised the boss something that horrified everyone who stood in front of him, because they thought that everything would end badly for them now. As it turned out, Zhang recommended the leader not to forget to smile. And when the leader did this and also called Yon darling, and asked if they were really going to remain silent from the outside, it looked as if he was about to eat everyone alive. You could see from Ryu how creepy the so-called smile of Cheju was, and the guy quietly asked the girl why the big guy looked so angry, while Mrs. Tan apologized for the misunderstanding because she knew that she should be careful with the gang. The chieftain wanted to know what the girl meant by misunderstanding, and she explained that they had accidentally entered the lands of the Green Forest when they were on their way to Chengdu and needed to make a stop. Yan assured the big guy that they would leave immediately at sunrise so as not to cause inconvenience. But the leader listened to Zhang, who encouraged the boss that his conversation with the girl was very natural. Miss Tan gently reminded the leader that until now, Green Forest had been on fairly good terms with her clan, and expressed her hopes that their arrival in the gang's territory would not create a rift in their alliance. And then a moment of awkward silence set in, not only from the strangers staying on the gang's territory, but also from the thugs themselves. Both sides froze in a silent question, but the problem was that no one knew how to react or answer further, so everyone froze like statues. Unexpectedly for the aliens, the leader and his gang began to turn in the opposite direction from them, which was a completely incomprehensible gesture. As soon as the big guys turned away from the little people, the leader fell into such a panic from not knowing what to do next, because the conversation with the girl had not yet gone that far. But Zhang was nearby, teaching the boss to remain calm in such moments. The bodyguard, looking at the circle of thugs, said out loud that he couldn't even imagine what they were talking about there. And Yan, supporting his thoughts, explained that this gang was like wild animals from whom it was impossible to predict anything. The new guy decided to use the heavy artillery and gave the order to the boss to use his charm, which the rude man did not understand at all, since he was hearing this for the first time and needed clear instructions for action. The newly minted mentor on how to win the attention of the ladies explained to his leader that he could show his confidence to the lady by demonstrating a calm and focused performance of his work, which the leader agreed to try to do. When Chengdu turned to the girl, his calmness was more like such icy cold-bloodedness that one could already dig a hole for oneself and die. And the next moment, when the leader, showing confidence, put his sword on his hand and said that he would pester only one person as a pass, Ryu's hair stood on end, and most likely not only on his head. The new guy was the same mountain of muscle without understanding how intimidating calm and confidence could look. So for him, the boss now looked like the standard of attractiveness. Zhang was amazed at how quickly the chief grasped the matter and admitted the next moment that the chief had surpassed him as a master of the art of handling girls. For the first time, Miss Tan looked confused and showed it not only with her whole appearance but also by voicing that she was not prepared for such a drastic decision regarding the entrance fee. The leader told Yang that she needed warriors for a peaceful return home and went down to the bodyguard who, although he was also in good physical shape, was a small fry compared to the main one, especially his knife. The next contender was the demon hater, but when Chengdu looked at her and did not understand what kind of creature she was, he decided it was better not to touch her. And so, poking the tip of his human-sized blade into Zhangwan's face, the leader delivered his verdict that only this guy remained as a pass. The head smiled at the girl, claiming that she didn't need such a breath, but Chengdu didn't receive a smile in return, but other abilities of the poisonous butterfly came into play. From one hand, the girl had already pulled out and prepared the needles she was accustomed to, on which she placed her middle and index fingers. But the other hand ended up on the thug's chest. But this was not a moment of flirting, because a blade was sticking out of the sleeve, also ready to pierce the leader's body. Standing in front of Ryu, the girl warned the leader to take his hands off the guy, since this was an important part of the trip home. Zhangwan began to rejoice too early, telling the lady to pierce the big guy with her poisonous needles at that moment, as the bodyguard understood the whole lousy situation. When the master did not understand what the bodyguard was trying to say, He explained to him that the bandits' bodies were so trained that no matter what weapon they were threatened with, they would not have a single scratch on their bodies, which is why everyone was so afraid of them. The bodyguard concluded that if the gang only needed one person, it would be better to agree to conditions that the one they wanted to sacrifice did not like. But for now, it was actually unclear whether the gang really needed a person as a pass, and if they did, then why? But Yeon continued to stand on the defensive and not take her eyes off the thug. Chengdu did not stop surprising with his strange behavior, and now he also began to either scream or roar like a beast. The next moment, Yeon couldn't understand at all what was happening, because the leader seemed to have grown even larger and, in addition, continued to make some extremely strange sounds. Here the lady was really scared and began to ask the chief to calm down and just talk without all this obscurantism. But the leader's screams only grew louder. The apogee of the boss's terrible state was 2 spurts of blood from his nose. And as it turned out, he had such a reaction only because the girl touched him. Poor Yeon was so scared and even stepped aside and removed her hand, trying to understand why the leader was bleeding, since she had done absolutely nothing. Chengdu stood in a pool of his own blood, and his brothers flew up to him, shouting how handsome he was, while the humans were horrified by what was happening. The men cried their rough tears, confessing that they believed in their boss and that they were proud of him, and the assistant couldn't miss it either, and came to pet this giant. The big guys stood in a circle again to discuss something important, and 3 people stared at them again, and this time Yeon wondered if this was some kind of special ritual for them. If the fearless poisonous butterfly was in shock, what can we say about the guy who seemed to have entered the world of Marine prepared for such incomprehensible things, but his knowledge did not protect him from such unexpected turns? The chieftain, pleased with himself and wiping his nose, turned to the lady that they should not hurry so much, which took her by surprise. But Chengdu only added that unfortunately, he had to leave for more important matters. But before returning to the camp, the boss turned around and asked the girl that the Poison King was having a holiday soon, and Yeon hesitantly confirmed this, but wanted to know why the leader needed this. Finally, Chengdu smiled, answering the butterfly until we meet at the festival, and thinking that he was still charming, he asked if the lady was waiting for this, which made him look creepy again. The level of the leader's charm could be determined by the expressions on the faces of the people who remained behind, and wondered if the big guy was still angry. The last thing that came from the thick of the forest and spread through the night wilderness were the shouts of the kids about how great their boss was, to which he asked them to behave more quietly, since he was just busy choosing a name for his future son. As the people had promised the gang, at dawn they set off on their way, and behind the mule was Ryu again, on top of whom was the hater again, once again commanding the pervert to hurry up. Miss Yong, eating her supply of donuts, announced that they still had 10 days to go. But the bodyguards didn't care, and the master was neither alive nor dead, and the dog even fell asleep asking the pervert to wake her up on the 3rd day. After some time, a butterfly was already sitting on top of the carry-on baggage, surprised at how comfortable it was, and if poor Jongwon was already exhausted from the role of a slave, then the hater announced that she was hungry again. The only moment when the guy's face at least slightly refreshed and he raised his head was after the mistress said that they were finally there, and the assistant immediately shouted to the perverted master that he should definitely take a look. The team approached the gate, and Yeon was already shouting from the threshold for the guards to hurry up, because she was terribly tired, and the dog also wiped imaginary sweat from her forehead after an imaginary long walk. While the young man was looking at Chengdu, Mrs. Yong warned him that he would first lay out his things, and then they would walk around the area to get a better look at everything. And first of all, they went to say hello, and the butterfly also warned Ryu about this, but he was already wary at that moment, because he did not yet understand who exactly they were going to meet. The guys entered the main house itself, and at the entrance they were immediately met by a golden statue of a cobra, with its hood spread and in a state before an attack, and there was some kind of strange fog in the room. Through the fog, a male voice reached the guests who, despite the severity, laughed and greeted the long-awaited friend of the Chagall clan. The fog cleared as soon as the huge man leaned over to look at the guy, and next to him stood Yong Yong, and if Ryu and the butterfly looked small compared to the ruler of poisons, then the assistant was even more like a bug. Since Chungwan was an ordinary person, he coughed from such a concentrated poisonous fog that the owner exhaled from his pipe, but the dog was again delighted, unlike the young man. Patriarch Tan Ji-woon enlightened the boy that he already knew about him from Mr. Chan, and in particular, he had heard about how the master saved his daughter from death. Ryu was still a little nervous in front of Mr. Jawoon, but after hearing what Cheon himself said about him, he felt calmer, and he also smiled back at the owner and was now more embarrassed than afraid. The Poison Lord noted his understanding of what a long journey they had made, and in the company of his daughter, so just in case, he asked if his daughter had behaved decently and asked the guy not to hide it, but to tell everything honestly. But how can you answer honestly here if right behind her father's back stood the daughter, and with eyes blazing with rage, looked warningly at the young man, not giving him a choice in the answer options? So he said that everything went well. Jivun was consoled by the guy's answer, but in his head every now and then there was something like a movie from some kind of terrible action movie with him, as the main character who suffered from a poisonous butterfly from the beginning of their acquaintance. The owner happily assured Ryu that he would be provided with accommodation so that he could feel at home and rest after such a long and difficult journey. Jungwon coughed once again in an attempt to thank the master, and the hater did not stop admiring the delights of being a guest in Chengdu. The patriarch thought, looking at the young man, and remembered the words of Chan, who spoke about meeting a righteous and wonderful person who, in his plans, would soon become part of the family. And just a few months ago, old good friends were sitting at Jivun's, reminiscing about old times, and the owner of the house asked how Cheagle's daughter was doing. Chun became despondent and shared with his friend that his daughter's condition had recently worsened, and they were again looking for a new doctor and treatment, and Jivun agreed that things were bad. Mr. Cheagle spoke about his worries about his daughter, because they had visited all possible and the best doctors in the Middle Lands, and Jivan again supported his friend by sharing the difficulty with him. In order not to escalate the situation, the owner decided to distract his friend and pointed out that it was time for their daughters to think about marriage. But then the Poison Lord became sad that his Yan was obsessed with martial arts, and Keon smiled and said that he did not have such a problem. But there was a worse problem in the form of rashes on Chan's face, and Chagall plunged into memories of his daughter's suffering because of her different eyes and how she was bullied for this reason. Chan suddenly encouraged himself with his own hopes for the appearance of someone who could light a fire in his daughter's heart, and felt that this hero was somewhere nearby. Jivun supported his friend's hopes, but immediately emphasized the importance of the groom's abilities, because he would take as his wife the one and only daughter of the patriarch of the most prestigious Cheagle clan in all the Middle Lands. Chagall was amused by such light and ironic pomposity and praise of his friend in his direction, but he also asked about the butterfly of the Tang clan, pointing out to Javan that he too was not from a poor family and wanted to know who his son-in-law would be. The men were already tipsy, and therefore emboldened to such an extent that Javan proposed a bet and Chagall supported it, and they agreed that whoever won would become the best, or, on the contrary, a loser, and the conversation ended with loud laughter from the two friends. But now, seeing Ryu off with his eyes, the owner saw the guy as an ordinary commoner and did not notice that Yong, leaning him against herself as she left the house, was already hitting him on the arm with her fist, threatening to deal with him if he blabbed about something in front of his father. And besides the slaps, the butterfly leaned towards the young man's face and with the same threat forced him to smile and not walk around with a sour expression forever. And Young Wan, in an attempt to stretch out his smile, looked so that you couldn't look at him without tears. Smoking his pipe, the ruler of Poison was amazed that Mr. Chan wanted to marry this simple and worthless boy to his only daughter, and immediately thought that he had already won the bet. But remembering that his daughter still had no one at all, the gentleman became sad and began to be tormented by the question of who would take her child as a wife. The next day, when everyone had had a good night's sleep, the first thing the hater and Yan did was eat a very tasty meal, and the dog's eyes ran wide from the options for dishes. The butterfly decided to start her meal with a dumpling that was of impressive size, indicating the presence of a large amount of hearty filling inside. Looking at the way the assistant ate, it was no wonder that Chen and Byun called her a dog, because only a little animal could eat like she did, while Yan calmly ate dumplings and noodles. The girl ate the food prepared by their cooks and it was worthy of taste, but now after what she tried from Ryu, even home-cooked food didn't seem so tasty to her, because it lacked what was in the master's dishes. Miss Tang remembered that evening when she tried the seaweed noodles that Ryu had improved, and was again a little embarrassed by the admission that it was really delicious. But then she muttered to herself that this bastard was probably very proud of himself. Butterfly, unlike the assistant who threw food into the firebox, didn't really enjoy the food, and looked out the window and thought about how Chong Wan had settled in there. And the guy at that moment really did settle in well, Not even because he was cooking, but because he was finally really resting, and his folding table was standing to the side. Ryu ate separately from the girls, and not all of it, and when he was full, he went to relax in the hot bath, from which steam was already spreading throughout the room. For the first time in such a long period of nervous events, the young man relaxed after eating his fill and felt the charm of the Tang clan's hospitality. But even at that moment, Ryu fleetingly thought about the tavern and that he would also make a separate bathroom for everyone in his hotel, because he hadn't even known about such a thing before. The master began to dive under the water with the thought that thanks to the appearance of Guanxi, with the Chagall clan in his life, he now has the opportunity to become closer to the Tang clan. The guy plunged under the water with his head, continuing his thoughts about how he reached such a level in connections, because just recently he appeared in this world only with the body of the young man Ryu Chongwan, and besides his knowledge and Ryu's knowledge, he had nothing else. Zhongwan remembered the whale and his death and realized that what happened to him then and now probably had no common sense or explanation. But there was one thing that still haunted the young man, and that was Rao Zhongwan's empty and confused memories, the reason for which he did not know. Still underwater instead of his thoughts, the guy heard someone call the name of the real owner of the body and saw a bloody and bruised hand near his face. An angry yawn burst into the room, not understanding why the master was not answering her, and the dog asked the pervert if he had anything tasty. But Ryu didn't hear the girls because he was staring at something creepy under the water, from which he froze and couldn't even move, and this something already took him by the face with both hands and called him its son. The butterfly walked around the room but could not find the guy and allowed herself the thought that perhaps he went out for a walk without waiting for her. The beaten and bloodied woman, without showing her entire face, asked her son to survive no matter what and no matter what it costs him. And with shouts about the water ghost and generally with screams, Ryu jumps out of the water and throws everything that was standing on the barrel and splashes water. The poor guy was breathing heavily, both because he had been underwater for a long time and because he was scared to death, because he still hadn't fully understood what it was in front of him. And for now, for his own peace of mind, he told himself that perhaps he was very tired. Now Yan was frozen, looking straight ahead at the completely naked guy, and it was already difficult for her to restrain herself from kissing him. Zhongwan saw that the butterfly was standing in shock and couldn't say a word, but he didn't understand why until he looked at where the girls were staring. At this point, both the guy and Yan started screaming, and only the assistant, who always took everything with delight, was not shy now either, and even offered a dumpling. While Ryu was pushing away the hater who was trying to feed the young man's little friend a dumpling, Mrs. Tan had already raised her hand to beat the guy up. Even though Zhongwan didn't do anything on purpose, he still got as much as he could from Yan, so much so that dust rose up from the room in a column. When the young man received a portion of slaps, he asked why the girls came to him, to which the still angry butterfly growled that, in fact, it is normal to close doors. The poor guy, all beaten up, asked for forgiveness for not thinking about closing up, but Yan was so furious and embarrassed at the same time that she told him to keep quiet. After some time of walking, Ryu, looking around, still risked asking Mrs. Tan where they were at the moment. Yan, walking ahead, repeated to the guy that she had mentioned an excursion after the rest, and that right now they were heading to the backyard, and added that in general, they should walk more. The boy and the girl were walking and discussing what size the backyard would be, and the dog at that moment already began to resemble a pig, only an irregular one, which found not truffles but mushrooms of dubious colors, admiring them as always. The butterfly explained that the yard they were going to was her grandfather's favorite place, and Ryu felt a lump in his throat from the mention of the king of poisons, and the hater had already raked up a bunch of mushrooms and was going down to the guys. Zhongwan felt uneasy just thinking about the creepy poison king, but he still asked the girl if the elder was still there. Yan herself didn't know whether her grandfather was in the yard or not, since he was a rather unpredictable person, and the assistant continued to follow everyone, changing the color of her face after each mushroom she ate. The young man stood for a while by the small lake where the carp was swimming, because he was interested in the fish that, in theory, should have been swimming in the pond. And the next thing that interested the cook were the flowers that looked strange. And to be on the safe side, he asked the lady if they were spices, and the dog had already changed its face from purple to yellow. Yan, without even turning around, warned the guy not to touch anything here, and for good reason, since there were 2 snakes lying in those very flowers. Even if the girl had not announced that they had arrived in the backyard, the young man would still have been taken aback by the beauty he saw. Ryu looked at the pride of the Sichuan Tang clan, which consisted of huge boulders covered with moss and fields of flowers. And among all this houses, but neither interfered with each other's existence, but on the contrary, lived in a beautiful symbiosis. Zhongwan walked with his mouth open among the purple flowers that were up to his waist, while the assistant shouted that she couldn't see anything, and indeed only the top of her head and a little of her hand were visible. Unsuspectingly, Ryu enjoyed the aroma of the petals that were flying around, but Yon warned him in time to be careful, because if he swallowed them, he would die. The butterfly said something pretty obvious, that everything in this garden was poisonous, which made the master start to move hysterically and spit. But Yon simply continued to explain that the beautiful petals were actually the leaves of the poisonous plant aconite. It was also quite logical that if the plant did not enter the body, then everything would be fine. But the assistant would not be herself if she had not already tried the plant, becoming the same color while asking nothing that she had already chewed it a little. Ryu tried to dig up knowledge from his past life about aconite and still remembered that this type of flower is wolf's bane, which was used as the main ingredient in poisons during the Joseon era. Thinking about his ability to get into such troubles, the guy saw in front of him and then felt something wet, sticky, and cold on his face. Raising his head up and watching where the strange sticky stuff was returning, Ryu saw a huge monster out of the corner of his eye. And when he saw the monster in its entirety, he screamed as if it had already eaten him alive, although in fact the creature simply took the poisonous petals from his face. A cute little grandpa appeared on top of the monster, who was very surprised by the young man's screams and did not understand what kind of monster was being talked about. Yan looked up and smiled and greeted her grandpa while Ryu hid behind the girl, still in shock from the beast. Poison King Tang Biryong finally heard a familiar voice and greeted his granddaughter in return, also being happy to see her. Grandpa noted that they hadn't seen each other for a long time, and he was terribly bored with everything here during this time. And Yon explained that she was a little busy carrying out her father's orders, and Ryu was standing behind her, concluding that the king of poison was not at all what he imagined. The guy, trembling all over, standing further behind the girl, asked in the same trembling voice what kind of monster the king was standing on. The poor toad was upset by such words, shedding tears, and the grandfather began to console and stroke his assistant, explaining to the guy that this was a spiritual creature, and the demon hater, who had already managed to make friends with the toad, shouted at the guy to apologize to her friend. The butterfly turned to the young man and introduced him to his assistant, Hong Sum, who eats only what contains poison so that Ryu does not have to worry about being eaten. Grandfather Ren approached his basket full of all sorts of things and asked who the guy was next to his granddaughter. But without waiting for an answer, the grandfather continued to say that his granddaughter's long attempts to learn to cook were really successful, and she found a groom, which made the girl horrified and her face flush. Yong ran up to her grandfather trying to catch him, but the old man had more than enough agility, so the girl simply waved her hands, seemingly shouting that he was completely crazy to say such a thing, and at that moment a scorpion was crawling along the guy's neck, which no one noticed, including him. The poisonous creature appeared on Chungwan's head, ready to strike, while the butterfly told the king that the young man was mentioned by Mr. Cheagle. Toad managed to save the guy in time by grabbing the scorpion with her tongue, but Yan didn't notice this because she was feeling terribly embarrassed while continuing to explain to her grandfather that Ryu would be attending his birthday instead of Uncle Cheon. The assistant had already settled down like a toad and was repeating the movements of her tongue after him, and Grandfather Ryan, having listened to his granddaughter's furious speech, calmly replied that he looked like an ordinary guy, and Father Yan would clearly not like him. The granddaughter, having cooled down, wanted to say something important about the young man regarding the celebration, but immediately replaced it with a more important thing about the fact that Ryu's cooking is a complete disaster. The grandfather froze, holding a flower in his hands after hearing about the boy's cooking skills, which so impressed his granddaughter. Yan's expression changed and she scolded herself in her thoughts. But when she tried to say something different, like the cooking was terrible, it was already too late. The elder turned around, repeating with an evil grin his granddaughter's words about the amazing cooking, which looked creepy and to some extent even threatening. A large hornet flew up to the flowers and buzzed quite loudly, but the granddaughter's voice was louder as she tried to convince her grandfather that she had made a mistake in her statement. But the insect not only did not have time to sit on the flower, but also did not live long, since death in the form of Khan's tongue immediately rushed after it. The little dog repeated the tricks of its new friend with its tongue, and the grandfather asked his dear granddaughter if she knew the reason for their clan's obsession with gourmet food. For the first time, Yan Yan was so surprised that she really didn't know this reason, although if you asked her about something about her family, she knew the answers to many questions. But Grandpa Ryan was already so old and therefore experienced, so he explained that the reason for the love of delicacies in food is their constant contact with poison, which makes the sense of smell more sensitive than that of an ordinary person. The king of poisons plunged into memories of his travels to many corners of the earth, meeting people who introduced themselves as the best cooks, but even these conditions did not give him the opportunity to taste the dish that would enter his soul. Having collected the necessary ingredients for himself, the old man emphasized that Ryu Chongwan was quite young and he was already being called outstanding, which was ridiculous for the elder. Ryu didn't really want to admit it, but still, in some moments the old man was right, namely, that the number of dishes that the guy could prepare was limited due to the limited ingredients and methods of their preparation. The young man, despite the threat of death, decided to ask the elder if he was hungry, but he immediately interpreted the young master's question as him wanting to show what he was capable of. And so the guy tied a tight bandage on his head, which indicated his readiness to prepare something for the king of poisons, and Ryu himself understood that he still had an ace up his sleeve in the form of knowledge and skills in preparing dishes from the future. Yon looked at the culinary master again, mesmerized, and her cheeks turned red from the exciting feeling she had for the young man. Since the guy was so confident, Grandpa Ryan suggested making a bet, which the guy did not understand, and the butterfly was already in shock, knowing what this would all lead to, but the king assured that if he liked the master's food, he could ask for anything. The thought that the tavern would finally gain fame and become alive moved the master, and he immediately agreed, which is why Yon Yon was shocked squarely, dissuading the guy from agreeing so easily and quickly. And only after the butterfly's words did Ryu think that he really didn't know what would happen if he lost. But the elder had already begun to explain from afar that recently his faithful assistant, Hong Sum, had become very skinny. Zhongwan, being a little naive, thought that he had never cooked for a toad before, especially since he only eats poisonous food, but Yon again tried to reason with the young man, saying that this was not about cooking for a toad. And the elder continued to explain that in the Middle Lands, there are many people who pretend to be martial arts masters, but in fact they are useless and liars who do not bring any benefit by themselves or their actions. The explanation almost reached its conclusion when Grandpa labeled such people as the poison that poisons the Middle Lands, and then Ryu began to guess what was going on. The Poison King climbed onto his loyal friend to move on with his business, holding a rather ominous pause before finishing with what would happen if the guy lost. Once in the saddle, the old man smiled evilly and made it clear to Chongwan that if he lost, he would become just as poisonous for his grandfather and Hong, that is, suitable for eating. When the king stroked the toad, comforting him that he could finally have a treat, the beast immediately licked its lips, and after it, the demon's hater, wanting to get a tasty morsel for herself too. Jumping into the distance, the old man shouted that when the guy was ready, he should whistle, and the assistant ran after them, jumping like a toad. Ryu stood and smiled nervously, hoping that the old man was joking about the poisonous people that the toad was feasting on. But Yon shook her head, also understanding what the guy had gotten himself into. The butterfly upset the master, that although her grandfather was strange, he never joked about such things, and the young man fell to his knees right in the flowers, already grieving about how his second life would end. The girl sighed, wondering into the air how it all came to this, and Ryu answered in his head that if she had praised his cooking, everything would have worked out. And then, in a rather familiar way, Yon grabbed the guy by part of his hair and dragged him somewhere, explaining along the way that since everything had already turned out this way, there was no point in sitting still. The butterfly dragged the master across a field of flowers, and it was driven by the enthusiasm to show him something important, and the young man mentally asked if she really wanted to show him his grave. But to their surprise, the boys came to a huge house and they walked along a road that was still strewn with petals of poisonous flowers. Yon Yon approached the doors of the house and, opening them, said that maybe she was exaggerating. But it was in this place that the master would be able to find spices and other necessary ingredients from all over the world. The cook's jaw almost dropped when he saw the place where the girl had brought him and what was inside, and the butterfly explained that having such a warehouse was normal for them because their love for delicacies was the pride of their family. Ryu couldn't get enough of the beauty in the house, and his eyes kept running from corner to corner, wanting to look at everything. When the master entered inside, he thought that he had entered heaven, but Jan brought him to the food warehouse of the Tang clan, where you can find everything you need for culinary masterpieces. Now the young man understood what the king meant when he talked about his travels, and the girl, already pleased, suggested that Ryu prepare his signature spicy noodles, and that would be the end of it. The cook continued to look at the abundance of products while Jan enthusiastically described that there was almost everything necessary here, thanks to which grandfather would still appreciate his cooking. Only the girl immediately showed the guy what a huge portion he should prepare. But Zhongwan thought that noodles were his special dish, that the old man would definitely like, and looked doubtfully at the bag of glutamate. But the master refused Jan about the noodles, which shocked her, because in that case, the toad Hong would definitely eat him, and that would be the end of the story. Only Ryu was setting himself up for a different scenario, reminding himself who he was and what he had always strived for, thus motivating himself. So he answered Mrs. Tan that this time he would surprise the elder with a different dish. The butterfly muttered under her breath, discontented and indignant, that she had expected to try the noodles again, but the master distracted her by asking about her grandfather's taste preferences. Here Yan became interested, and she told Ryu that her grandfather was from Sichuan and therefore really loved spicy dishes. Zhongwan immediately began to analyze the presence of spicy food in the warehouse as the scanner began to analyze it, and remembered that he had seen several spices and black pepper and was holding some kind of root similar to wasabi in his hands, but then he noticed something unique out of the corner of his eye. In the eyes of the culinary master, the ingredient shone like the rarest and most expensive diamond in the entire world, so Ryu asked the lady what it was. The guy wanted to know where this jewel in the warehouse came from, and Yang, understanding what the master was staring at, said that periodically they have traders from the western provinces in India. The girl assumed that their cooks did not use the product because they did not know what it was, and immediately asked if the young man had already dealt with such an ingredient. The master realized that the product would become the pillar of all Sichuan cuisine, and Yang replied that in front of her was his hot majesty, the chili pepper. The day of judgment has come, and in the backyard nothing has changed except for the growling of the elder's stomach, who was very hungry. Hong Sum was catching hornets with his dog, and the king of poisons couldn't calm down and impatiently asked if the guy had finished cooking. And just at that moment, the master walked towards the grandfather, turning to the elder, and he turned around at the confident voice of Chongwan. Ryu walked through a meadow with flowers, with petals flying around him, and as always he carried a dish in one hand, only this time it was covered with a cap. The young man leaned towards his taster for today, asking for forgiveness for such a long wait, and began to open the cap from which steam was coming out. The master presented the elder with a dish prepared personally for him as mapo tofu with rice, and the grandfather was more disappointed than surprised. Yan couldn't believe what the young man had done, and the old man also supported his granddaughter, although she didn't say anything. But the Poison King was disappointed in the guy's ability to choose tofu among many other ingredients. But the dish already had at least historical value, because it appeared in Sichuan at the end of the 19th century during the reign of the Qing dynasty, and the name was formed in honor of the woman who cooked it, where Mara Ryabaya and Po is an elderly woman. No matter how disappointed Ryan was, he still decided to try the food, because in fact he had never seen such a tofu dish before, and after eating a spoonful, the old man commented that it was moderately spicy and not bad in taste, but not outstanding. But instead of grandfather, his body suddenly spoke, showing how the sharpness had just begun to cover the tongue with piquancy and spread further. Ryu already realized that he had done everything perfectly, so all that was left was to wait and watch until the main ingredient took effect, and ask the elder to carefully taste the dish. It is clear that the assistant was already reaching for at least a piece of Ryu's cooking, but poor Yan was drooling more profusely than the dog this time, and Ryan had already blushed slightly and continued eating because at first it seemed to him that the dish was slightly spicy. Hong appeared in front of the owner questioningly, waiting for his verdict, but the old man asked him to wait and began to eat spoon after spoon. The granddaughter asked her grandfather not to rush to eat the food because no one would take it away from him, and looked towards the guy. This time the sly grin was on Chongwan's face, and not his grandfather's, because the guy understood that it was now that the cumulative sharpness was starting to take effect. Grandpa hadn't even eaten half of the portion yet, but you could already tell how hot the food was, but not because of the physical temperature. Once the master tried to chop the products into small crumbs for Mrs. Chagall so that she could eat after a severe allergy, And this time with tofu, the guy was able to please the grandfather whose teeth are no longer in the same shape as before. Tofu was chosen as the main ingredient for Mappo so that the old man could easily taste all the delights of the prepared food. The master put his slicing skills into action, and with a few deft movements, the tofu was transformed into perfectly sized cubes. After shredding, the tofu had to be fried in oil to create a hard crust in order to preserve its shape and not lose the juiciness of the product. But the most important ingredient this time was chili pepper, which could best give the dish the necessary spiciness. From his past life, the young man knew that the word mala or the dish malatan was associated with spicy food. But in this world, such a thing had not yet appeared. If we decipher the meaning of the word mala, then the ma part meant tingling or numbness on the tongue from spices. Now the la part is an ingredient that is used to get the heat and pungent taste that is chili pepper, but it was not yet widely known in the Middle Lands. Ryu didn't know for sure, but he guessed that a small amount of chili peppers had come to Sichuan and were stored in a warehouse for a reason. The pepper ended up in the warehouse because one of the chefs wanted to try to surprise the king of poisons with a spiciness he had never experienced before. Along with the elder's strength and feelings, flower petals rose into the air, and Yan, noticing this phenomenon, immediately asked how her grandfather was feeling. But Ryan made it clear that he was completely fine, and even better, and perhaps he had already convinced himself that it was not so acute. But the old man's condition, which was visible on his face, said otherwise. Zhongwan voiced his joy that the elder liked the dish, and he himself knew that if you compare the sensations of sangshul, which is in spices, and capsaicin, which is in chili peppers, the latter wins in cumulative spiciness. Grandpa couldn't believe that he was getting spicier every time he ate another spoonful of food, but he continued to eat. The master observed the elder's inability to stop and tear himself away from eating the dish, which proved the correctness of the choice of ingredient. Ryan seemed to be no longer in the backyard, but somewhere on top of a volcano, continuing to savor the piquant taste and soft texture of the tofu, which combined perfectly with the spiciness that made his tongue feel like it was burning. An ordinary person would have sadly finished his meal, or maybe even fatally, but no matter how much the old man felt like his insides were being burned by a deadly poison, he continued to eat, reminding himself that he was Tan Bi Ryong, and he was resistant to all types of poison. The king, already feeling like a dragon, tried to convince himself that the level of spiciness of this dish was insignificant for him. And then lava began to appear from the cracks of the volcano. Such were the sensations, and in front of the elder stood a bowl with the last spoon of the dish. Having exhaled the hot air from his body, the grandfather continued to tell himself that there was nothing special about it, although it turned out pretty good. But he looked carefully at the last spoon. Ryan picked up the spoon with the last piece of food, and for some time he couldn't bring himself to eat this dish, which was not very spicy. But for the king of poisons to be afraid of the last spoonful of some unfortunate and not even spicy rice porridge with tofu, it would not be him. Now the old man, no longer so red in appearance and glowing, was calmly chewing the last spoonful of the spicy dish. But then, instead of swallowing the food, Ryan stopped chewing, feeling like his throat and his whole body were on fire, and he simply didn't have the strength to eat the rest of the food. The elder screamed furiously, as if from the depths of his soul, about his insensitivity, and lava gushed out of the cracks and fountains. That very immunity of the king of poisons himself was broken, although he had never experienced anything like it in all his 80 years of life. The level of deliciousness of the dish felt as strong as a volcanic explosion, at the epicenter of which was the old man himself. When the grandfather returned from the volcano to the earth to his granddaughter and master Chongwan, his satisfaction knew no bounds. The king acknowledged that the young man was worthy of praise and said that he really cooked very well, and it was really very tasty. Ryu folded his hands in a respectful gesture and thanked the old man for the recognition, adding that it was an honor for him to prepare poisons for the king of poisons himself, while Yan just stood to the side dumbfounded. Butterfly noticed again that when the guy started cooking, it was as if he was transforming into another person, and this was irritating, although judging by the blush on his cheeks it was more captivating and enchanting. The elder was already standing on top of Hong, and reminded the master that since he was able to please him, it was time to fulfill the promise according to the bet, but asked Zhongwan to think carefully before doing so. Among the flying petals, the king's voice reached the young man's ears, indicating that the wish could be anything from money to a living person. And then Grandpa Ryan realized that he had completely forgotten about his faithful friend and assistant behind all the impressions of the dish. The old man stroked the toad, asking him for forgiveness for the fact that today, unfortunately, He was without fresh human food, and along with Hong, the assistant also became sad, after which Ryu mentally called these two idiots who found something to be upset about. Several days had already passed and the time for the king's birthday was approaching, and Ryu, sitting on one of those days, was still thinking about what to ask the elder. The guy thought about advancing the tavern's affairs, but then he pulled himself away, realizing that things wouldn't get any better, so he shifted his focus to money or some value. Exhaling heavily, the young man put this idea aside for now and thought that the celebration was today, which meant that he would soon be able to return to his favorite tavern and continue his business. Suddenly, Ryu heard the voice of Mrs. Tan above him, who came to ask why the guy was sitting here alone, and when he raised his head, he saw her above him and was a little scared. Zhongwan tried to explain that he wanted to sit here alone with his thoughts, to which Yan rephrased that he was bored, and the master thought that the young lady could at least pretend to listen to him while the dog ate flowers. Butterfly shared with Ryu that she wanted to watch the preparations for the birthday and therefore came to ask the guy if he would keep her company, if of course he was not busy. And in addition, they invited a famous chef and the hater immediately flew in. The girl was able to interest the cook in the cook, and Zhongwan agreed because it was an opportunity to gain new experience and knowledge for his own business promotion. Yan jumped up from her seat, shouting that in that case they should hurry because the preparation could end at any minute, and Ryu began to descend from the rocks, and the hater as always urged on her demon. The girl also urged the guy on, but she did it with a smile and kindly, and such sudden concern was unusual for him. Yan ran ahead like a happy child, explaining that food tastes best while it's cooking, and the young man simply rushed after her, thinking that let it be as she says. The boys came to the entrance to the main kitchen of the Tang clan, from which steam was already actively escaping from the preparation of dishes for the celebration. As soon as the guy went inside, he immediately felt the commotion that was happening in the kitchen because one of the workers was carrying boxes of fresh products and asked the young man not to stand by the aisle. Surprisingly, it was Yan who was delighted when she also entered the kitchen, shouting, "Isn't this heaven?" while looking at all the delights of Sichuan cuisine. If Zhongwan was surprised by how many cooks there were in the kitchen today, the dog had already grabbed some food for itself and was delighted only with it. And Yan explained the logic of such a number of workers by the fact that when they work together, they get it done on time. The butterfly had already seen the object of her adoration and asked the cook to let her try it, to which she asked the lady to wait until the main feast. Ryu immediately recognized what was being cooked in the wok, and it was a dish called lan yang, which was prepared from lamb meat that was stewed with spices and vegetables. The young master knew that this dish was a rarity in these parts, since lamb was not often found. The master admitted that the dish looked quite appetizing, although it was difficult to prepare, and Yan was still arguing with the cook for being greedy and not letting her try even a piece, but the hater was not stopped by the worker's words and was already slurping from the wok. Just as Jungwan was thinking about who this famous chef was, a stern voice sounded behind him. The owner wanted to find out who had caused the pogrom here. Chef Jang Sam appeared in the kitchen, and upon seeing Miss Tang causing a ruckus in the kitchen, immediately changed his tone and facial expression, but he still asked what brought her here in the midst of preparations. Yan, having stolen the meat with her mouth full, answered the chef that she just wanted to watch the preparation of food for the festive table, and immediately turned the focus of attention to the guy, indicating that he was interested in his cuisine, and Ryu introduced himself as the owner of the hotel and restaurant. The young man was able to interest the professional in his property, and Mr. Zhang immediately asked whether the hotel was located in the Kibon area, which was the capital of the Song dynasty. Ryu was embarrassed that the boss included his hotel among the best in the list of 72 hotels in the capital, and timidly admitted that he had a small hotel in Simwuyon. And now the true essence of the great chef was revealed after his arrogant and caustic answer about having visited all corners of the Middle Lands in order to talk with some owner of a provincial eatery. Zhongwan did not understand such a humiliating tone at all, and even more so did not expect it, because for him, this person was first and foremost someone from whom he wanted to take an example and ask for advice. Zhang continued to explain to the young man, in a humiliating tone as if he were a fool, that if he didn't know, then in front of him was the chef of the imperial family, Zhang Sam, and the student of Deryong Suksu Huangong, which is the third rank of chef, and the title is passed down from generation to generation. Having finished the piece of meat, Yan stared at the upstart, declaring that whoever he was, his tone was inappropriate, and Ryu, smelling the fried smell, asked the lady not to get excited. The guy saw moments from his past life before his eyes, from which he concluded that those who were at a fairly high level in the culinary arts often had a difficult character. The boss had no time to mess around with this worthless guy, and he kindly allowed the young man to watch the process if he was interested, but warned him not to interfere, and if he wanted to know something, it would be better to ask a question. Zhang was rotten inside despite the titles and everything else, so he once again spat sarcastically at Zhongwan that he really should have learned how to ask questions first, and against this background, the assistant had already stolen the wok with lamb, and Yan only managed to see it. Ryu had a pretty good argument for this arrogant guy not to yelp, because he wasn't in his own kitchen, but instead, modesty took over, and the guy thanked the gentleman, but it was unclear for what. The girls distracted the master from the unpleasant feeling of humiliation, and when he turned around, he saw Yan and the hater who did not understand what kind of dish was in front of him. Ryu's professional knowledge immediately came into play, and he explained that the dish was called seisuhei, which was based on live crab, but the guy was surprised that it was the first time he had seen it served in a shell. Zhongwan explained that the name of the dish came from the ease of preparation, because it was served before washing hands, which is what seisuki means in Korean. Wash your face and hands, and all because the crab meat is removed from the shell, and the spices that you like are added to it. The guy admitted that the choice of dishes was good because they were both appetizing in appearance and taste, which led to the conclusion that the chef really understands delicacies. Zhang did not miss Ryu's explanation and supposedly praised the young man, pointing out that his knowledge was not bad for a simpleton from the village, and the chef wanted to know where he learned about the dish. The young master, instead of answering the gentleman's question, drew his attention to the fact that the dish could not be served on the table. It was like a slap in the face, which caused the boss to turn to the young man and was ready to incinerate him with just one look. Zhongwan pointed out the impossibility of serving the dish on the table, not on an empty place. And for this, he even brought in Yan as a witness, asking if she saw black spots on the shell, and of course the girl answered in the affirmative. And after the stains were noticed, the master explained using terminology that crab spoils quickly, and tyrosine, which is in the body's juices, oxidizes, which is why stains appear, and fresh meat can be eaten, but spoiled meat cannot be eaten without heat treatment. Ryu made it clear that there could be stomach problems if the guests ate the spoiled meat, and Yan agreed with him, and the guy added that perhaps, due to the haste, the cooks might not have noticed the mistake. Zhang took this remark personally, although the young man immediately spoke about the cook's mistake, and the chef, through gritted teeth, threateningly told the young man to repeat once again what he, the great cook, had done. But Zhongwan didn't even have time to answer something as the chef flew up to him and knocked the shell out of his hands, shouting that he was a brat and had no right to judge his cooking, and it looked so childish, although the man could have controlled himself. But emotions got the better of him. It took literally a split second for the meat to fly past the young master's face, and he immediately caught the terrible smell of spoiled product with his sensitive sense of smell. Zhang continued hysterically naming again whose student he was and what his title was, while accusing the guy of insulting both the boss and his teacher. Finally, while Ryu was looking at the meat on the floor, the chef poked the guy in the nose like a mangy kitten so that he knew his place, and that the great culinary guru would do everything to ensure that the brat got what he deserved. But Zhongwan did not listen to the man's hysteria, and only covered his mouth because his suspicions were confirmed, and he felt disgusted by both the sight of the meat and its smell, which was hidden with vinegar and herbs. The young master would have betrayed himself in his calling if he had not directly asked the chef whether he really thought he could remain unnoticed in an attempt to hide the rottenness of the product, and this blew the chef's mind. Since Ryu hit the nail on the head and no one liked the truth, Zhang furiously shouted at the young man to shut his mouth right now. But now Mr. Tan himself came to the scream and from the very beginning wanted to know why there was such screaming and what was going on. The boss, like a little boy with a sour expression on his face, turned to the gentleman and shouted at him that it was wonderful that he was here. Father Yong sat down on a box and began to listen to Zhang's complaints about the village freak who brazenly just threw out the dishes, which is why there is a risk of not making it in time for the holiday. And in addition, the young man also insulted him as a great cook and his teacher, which is why Zhang started shouting. Unlike the hysterical women, Mr. Tan respectfully addressed the young master, asking if everything was so, because if the boss's words were confirmed, he would have to take action. Ryu looked down at the floor but decided to explain the situation as he saw it, and pointed out that in the world among the cooks, there are many whose skills are weak due to lack of experience, and the guy considered himself to be one of them. But there was another side to the coin, which the young man also highlighted, pointing out those chefs who do not admit their imperfections because of pomposity and arrogance. And in conclusion, Zhang Wan pointed out many types of cuisines, next to which there are the same number of types of cooks, but the worst of them, in the guy's opinion, was the one who was not honest with himself or his cooking, and he pointed his finger at Zhang. Mr. Tang liked the young master's speech, and in his eyes he looked more ambitious than the Poison Lord had imagined. It was already getting dark, and Mr. Tan's voice could be heard from the kitchen, his verdict being the only solution in this situation, the difference in the chef's versions. The owner made it clear to both masters that conflicts on the estate were traditionally resolved by taking part in a bimu, or in other words, a competition of martial arts masters to see who would be the strongest win. The joyful Lord of Poison reminded that on the occasion of today's feast, in honor of the holiday, both masters will take up cooking by taking part in a cooking competition. Emotions took over again, and Zhang, shouting once again whose student he was, pointed his hand almost in the face of the young man, asking Mr. Tan if he really wanted him, the great culinary guru, to compete with the village idiot. Tan remained calm and with a smile assured the boss that he did not have to worry about losing or tarnishing his reputation. After all, in front of Zhang for a second, the representative of the Chigal clan and Ryu specially took out the token that Mrs. Chan gave him. The Poison Lord, respecting his old friend Qian, made it clear to the arrogant man that although he was a super student of a super teacher, the reputation of the Chigal clan was no less. The masters simultaneously grimaced as if the corners of their mouths had been pulled down with a rope after they heard Mr. Tan's conclusion about the condition that the loser would never cook again. As a jury, Tan chose guests who would gather in the backyard and fairly choose the one whose cooking would be the best. Ryu's heart sank into his stomach, realizing that he was risking his career as a chef for the sake of a competition, while Zhang continued to underestimate the villagers' abilities out loud, so he easily agreed to the duel. The Poison Master chose the theme for the competition in the form of a dish that would be the main decoration of the Sichuan Tang clan's feast, and wished the masters good luck. Ryu already felt a surge of strength and energy, so he was not at all against showing what he was capable of, since he had already been able to please the most fastidious lovers of delicious food more than once. The sky turned a soft cream color, and the backyard took on a different hue, becoming more mysterious, and that's when all the guests gathered to honor the King of Poisons. The king's son, sitting at one of the main places at the table, was grateful to everyone who came to the feast in honor of his father's holiday. And the elder himself felt so bored sitting among everyone that collecting poisonous beetles was a more fun activity for him. Grandpa Ryan became even sadder because he was going to go to his grave soon anyway, and he was spending his birthday so boringly, and the guests asked the old man not to say stupid things and continued to congratulate him. But his son had saved a cooking competition as the highlight of the holiday. Under the announcement of the Poison Lord that the chef is famous throughout China and also organized today's treats, and this is the imperial chef Zhang Sam, the master approached the table that was prepared for him and put the necessary products. The guests turned their attention to the dishes that stood before them after they heard that the chef had prepared for the emperor himself, and that they too would now be able to taste rare delicacies. Mr. Tan also pointed to the other side and introduced everyone to the second participant in the competition, the official representative of the Chigal clan. Jivun smiled with some hope for the guy's victory and pointed out to the guests that the second participant was also distinguished by his skill. And finally the gentleman called the chef, Ryu Zhongwan, while Yan brought the bowl to the table and the young man wiped his hands in preparation for cooking. The King of Poison was already interested in the fact that the guy had a lot of knives on the board and the grandpa wanted to know why he needed so many. Mr. Jiwon announced the theme of the culinary competition to everyone, and it was a dish that would be the highlight of the Sichuan Tang clan's feast. The Poison Lord indicated that this was not just a cooking competition, but first and foremost a competition of ambitions and reputation, thereby setting the chefs up for a low start. In order not to delay such an interesting moment, Jivun raised his cup of drink and asked the cooks to start preparing the dishes. Yan, being a very brave girl, was now looking at the bowl that she had brought to the table for Ryu and excitedly asked if he would really use this particular product for cooking. The master dipped his hand into the water, confidently showing the butterfly what he would really cook from what was in the water. But she continued to worry, wanting to know if the chef had ever dealt with such an ingredient. Some kind of fish appeared in the guy's hands, and he assured the girl that he had already worked with such a product, but he didn't clarify out loud that the only difference was that it was in another life. With just one choice of ingredient, the master shocked not only the guests, but also the grandfather finally became interested in watching what was happening. Chongwan put the main product of today's dish on the board, fugu fish, which originates from China and Korea, and in order for the fish to be as tasty as possible, it must be caught in the spring. One of the guests couldn't believe his eyes, so he shouted out, "Is the cook really going to cut up Hayden now?" And the assistant was content with what was already on the table, but she also repeated the gentleman's question. Continuing to prepare his dish, Zhang only smiled maliciously, teasing his rival that he was a complete idiot for wanting to poison all the guests with his cooking. Even the poison lord himself was a little confused looking at what the young man was going to do, but for now he decided to remain silent and watch what would happen next. It was not for nothing that Jiwoon was confident in Master Chongwan, because he was confident in his knowledge and skills that the fugu fish was also called hadong in ancient China or water pig, and despite the dangerous poison, it was valued for its life-filled taste. At the time where Ryu was, the price for not knowing how to cook fish was someone's life. Although this was the only way people gained experience by trying different methods of processing the product to neutralize the poison. The most interesting part began, and this time the master's assistant was Yongyong herself. So she had to hand over the knives on command, and the first was gudao, or bone knife. The guy used a bone knife to cut the spine at the back of the neck to draw blood, and the problem was the depth of the cut, which had to be optimal. Otherwise the intestines would be damaged or not all the blood would come out. Ryu calmly threw the fish back into the water, asking Yong to be careful since blood is also poisonous. And the master did this so that the fish would get rid of the remaining blood in the water. But the lady was not so much scared as she was disgusted. The guests were not wildly delighted, but in quiet horror, and were already discussing that the cook himself would have to taste the fish first, and while they were worried, the demon hater sucked in the food like a vacuum cleaner. Ryu took the fish back onto the board and gave a short command to Sandao, that is, the silk knife, which made Yong furious that she was not actually a servant here. But Zhongwan remained unmoved and continuing to hold his hand in front of the lady, again said only the name of the knife, which in some way amazed her. Yon was embarrassed again by how confident the guy was while cooking, and now she could take a direct part in all of this and obediently handed over the knife. Zhongwan has actually placed a very important part on the butterfly, because he knows that choosing the right knife for each stage of preparation will determine the safety of the product. To clean the fish from all inedible parts such as eyes or liver, the master used 3 more knives. The first was Gaogongdu, or light, then Pandao for slicing, and the last was Shaoladao, and Yon caught and served all of this. The elder continued to watch with interest the young man who had already pleased him once, and now also at least knew what would happen to him. But since the thoughts were voiced out loud, one of the guests replied that the king could not worry because nothing threatened him. Zhang picked up on the guest's words, repeating to the king that he really didn't have to worry because first he could taste a dish from the imperial chef. The great chef carried the dish, again reminding that he had learned how to prepare it from Huanggong himself, and that Zhang had prepared this food for the emperor himself. The guests were delighted, and were already reaching for the dish with their chopsticks, drooling and simultaneously asking what its name was. The chef emphasized the emotional connection that would be reinforced by the taste, saying that the dish brought tears to the emperor's eyes when he tried just one piece of hui guo ru, and that Ryu, hearing this, already knew that it was pork with vegetables. Jiwoon commented that the dish looked very good, but immediately asked if it could be a decoration for the Tang clan's table. The self-confident chef logically argued that the dish could be a decoration for the Tang clan table, given that the emperor is the ruler of China, and here in Sichuan, the ruler of martial arts is the king of poisons. Continuing the logical chain, the cook concluded that a dish worthy of an emperor was also worthy of the birthday of the king of poisons, while the guests ate the treat and the hater simply destroyed it. Zhang approached the birthday boy himself to ask what he thought about the dish, and whether it was worthy of being a table decoration, but was horrified to see that he had not even touched the plate, and asked what was the reason for that. The imperial chef's question was answered by Ryu, who came closer and pointed out that it was not a matter of the taste of the dish, but that the elder did not like the brazen lies of the arrogant man, which shocked Zhang again. And here Jiwoon became interested in what the catch was. So, with his question, he made the guy understand that he could speak out in favor of the opponent. Zhongwan immediately pointed out that pork is the main ingredient of huiguoru, so the dish is not served on the imperial table. And this fact is enough to understand that Zhang not only does not know anything about imperial cuisine, he also does not have the title of Huan Gong's disciple. Here the cook himself began to give himself away both externally and verbally, sweating and stuttering, unable to put together a sentence. The guests immediately spat the meat out of their mouths, at least those who could, because some of them actually threw up, and they all couldn't believe that the cook fed them dirty meat. Ryu knew that, unlike in his past life, in this world pigs were dirty animals for people, and even if their meat was used, it was only by the poor sections of the population. The Poison King sighed very heavily and looked sad, which made Zhang look very pale, and he began to get even more nervous. But the most terrible thing was the elder's conclusion that, as he had once already mentioned, almost everyone who acts in this way is poison that has no right to exist. These were the very words that the false imperial cook was afraid to hear, because the king of poison was the one to joke with. Naturally, at such moments, many people's lives flashed before their eyes, and Zhang was no exception. So he remembered how he was born into a poor family in a village. Little Zhang's next memory was of a difficult childhood due to the fact that his parents could not afford either education for the child or martial arts, for which, moreover, he was very weak due to lack of food. And the dish that the cook served today was made from cheap products, but they couldn't even afford pork. But when his mother cooked it for him, it was a holiday for the boy. The son thanked his mother and praised her cooking by comparing her to Huang Gong. And then he compared his mother herself to a famous chef, which made his mother smile and mysteriously answer that maybe that was true. Since the paths of knowledge and martial arts were inaccessible to little Zhang, the only thing left for him was cooking, and he dreamed of one day becoming Huang Gong's student. When Zhang Samu turned 14 and tried to get into some establishment as a cook, he was driven out because the young man did not have any guanxi, that is, connections. The guy still continued to try to get a job at least as a cleaner in small restaurants, but the workers threw him out, insulting him and reminding him where his place was. When the young man turned 16, he still had not given up hope of getting somewhere, and he did not want to give up. And so, after yet another refusal, the 17-year-old boy decided to lie to himself and believed that he was a student of Huang Gong himself. Thereby he lied to others as well. Hiding behind the name of a famous person, they immediately apologized to the young man and were surprised why he did not immediately tell them such important information. And although the young man was shrouded in lies from head to toe in the kitchen, the responsibility for preparing food did not disappear for a second. The other workers kept discussing that the chef was responsible for preparing the event in the city center, and that he had strong guanxi, and that the emperor himself called him a genius. Until he was 18, Zhang had never been a student of a great chef, but he dreamed of becoming at least a daring suksu. And so Zhang returned to reality standing in front of the king of poisons and could not believe that he would die in this way. And the old man continued to talk about poison in the form of people like him, and that this poison was poisoning the martial arts masters of Sichuan. Grandfather began to turn towards the cook, saying that he could no longer tolerate this, which sounded like a death sentence. And Zhang tearfully asked the king to have mercy and not kill him, because he had only just begun to make his way in life. But the old man turned to Ryu with a request to speed up and pointed his finger at the plate in the young man's hands, really wanting to taste his dish. Now, for 19-year-old Zhang, such words were even worse than death, when it was the dangerous dish of the unknown guy that was confessed, and not his delicious pork. Zhongwan replied to the elder that he had indeed waited for so long, so the dish was ready to be eaten. The master served the freshest cut of fugu fish, which is called sashimi, and it looked magnificent because it resembled a flower. The guests were amazed by the sophistication of the dish and its presentation. But then they remembered that the fish was raw and therefore poisonous, and this only caused disappointment. The poison lord noticed that the fish fillet, and not just any fish but hadona, was laid out in the shape of a flower and on a plate with a purple pattern. Even for Ji-woon it seemed incredible, although he had seen a lot in his life. But he was rather amazed by the fact that the guy was able to please their family again. As Yan brought another plate of fish fillet flour, Ryu confirmed Mr. Tan's words regarding the appearance of the dish. Yi Yan was taken aback when she heard that she was now carrying in her hands the symbol of the legendary Sichuan Tang clan, which is called Tanghua Yupian, which means fish fillet flowers. Ryu wished the guests a pleasant appetite just as the first volunteer picked up a piece of fillet in his chopsticks, and was able to see the guy through it. While everyone was salivating and they really wanted to try the fugu but were afraid and only bombarded the king with questions, he, in turn, was the first to try the dish. The old man, with a sly expression on his face, informed everyone that he was taking on such a responsible mission to try it and then informed the others whether they should eat it. The guests were amused by the elder's answer, since he is immune to poisons. So on the one hand, they were glad that they were not the first to try, but on the other hand, nothing would happen to the king. And then the elder was so surprised that he jumped up and almost hanged himself. And after he started coughing, he scared everyone with his condition. Grandpa Ryan began to move his hands very quickly, and from behind it was unclear what was happening. Besides, he assured everyone that he hadn't tried it yet, and he needed time because he didn't want to risk anyone. But the old man's plan was cunning, and having said that he would try another piece, he took several pieces of fillet with chopsticks, and, enjoying himself, deceived everyone. The guests could no longer bear it, especially when they saw the king gobbling up the fish. They couldn't stand it any longer and pounced on the plate. The gentlemen were still afraid, but decided that even if they died from this dish, it was worth the risk, and the fillets were snapped up like hotcakes. Chongwan was proud of himself, realizing that he had opened up new horizons for people. So when he saw how they were trying to try everything, he reassured them that if necessary he would bring more. For the people of this world, such a dish was made in a completely unfamiliar way, but the body was enveloped in trepidation so much that it was difficult to resist and not try it. The guests made different sounds from enjoying the food, still not believing that it was just a fish platter, but in doing so they made it clear to the master that a culinary saga had now begun for him. And what was the surprise of the Lord of Poisons himself when he tried the fugue, not understanding just how the guy was able to achieve such a deep taste. The thing was that the chef was able to achieve such an ideal texture of the fillet using his knife skills, and the dog and Yong Yong were able to feel this entire spectrum. For Ryu, the most important result was seeing how happy people were after eating the food he prepared. And now he also saw that for them, it was more than just food. If it were possible to somehow describe or depict the sensations that people experienced when trying fugu, it would be an explosion of beautiful taste. Moreover, this explosion was felt by everyone who was at the table at that moment, and people looking at each other and finding confirmation that they were not the only ones who thought so only intensified their feelings. From the explosion that all the guests experienced, the one they saw in the sky woke up and they asked each other if they also saw something similar. Yan immediately asked her father if he knew what it was, and Jawoon, calmly continuing to savor the fish, replied that such a phenomenon was not surprising. The king, continuing to enjoy the dish, said that he had not seen anyone like the one who had just appeared in the sky for quite a long time. A guest appeared in front of everyone, heading towards the one who was guilty of waking him up in the first place. Every single guest understood that the dragon had come to Ryu Chungwan because only he could make everyone feel extraordinary pleasure from the food today. Ryu encountered this for the first time in this world, and he felt a little uneasy as the dragon began to circle around him. Mr. Jivan was very happy about this phenomenon because in front of them was a culinary dragon, which already said a lot. From that moment on, no matter how scared the young man was, he was given a new nickname, Culinary Dragon Ryu Jongwan. The Lord of Poisons was ready to announce the results of the competition, with which absolutely everyone present agreed. Mr. Tan raised his hand up from the boy's side and calling his new nickname and the clan he was a representative of, declared Ryu the winner. The king also praised the young man and his dish, reminding himself that the poisonous thing today was not the Hayden. The sweet elder instantly turned into a terrifying demon who furiously accused Jang of insulting everyone here by lying about himself and forcing him to admit that he was just a worthless swindler. As soon as the old man said the name of his assistant, Hong Sum was right there, flying in a jump over his master, hurrying to feast on the poisonous man. The toad jumped right in front of Jang, knocking him to the ground, and behind him, Grandpa Ryan told him that the pet would finally be able to have a good treat. Han did not hesitate and pulled out his huge and sticky tongue towards the cook, who only begged for mercy, continuing to lie numb with fear in the poisonous flowers. Just as Hong flew up to Jang, Ryu himself rushed forward, asking the elder to stop because he had something to say. Jungwon miraculously managed to close the toad's mouth, preventing it from swallowing the false cook, although he had almost grabbed onto him and could have swallowed him without a trace. Yan was so worried about the young man that she didn't notice her father standing nearby, who in turn noticed his daughter's worry about the boy. Ryu, standing in front of the huge monster, turned to the king with a reminder that he promised to fulfill any one of his wishes. Grandpa smiled, saying that he remembered their agreement, and asked the guy why he remembered it now. Ryu, realizing that it was too early for the guy to die, asked the master to forgive Zhang and give him another chance at another life. Under the moonlight, two contestants stood at the entrance to Chengdu, and Ryu was grateful to his opponent for competing in the Poison King Festival competition. The guy addressed Zhang as a lord, folding his hands in a respectful gesture and bowing to say goodbye, but he remained silent. And yet, after a short pause, Zhang decided to ask Master Zhongwan a question before leaving, which surprised the guy, and the loser was worried about how a commoner earned a connection with the Chigal clan. Ryu became a little gloomy from the fact that Zhang told the real truth, that from the outside he looks like the most ordinary rural youth. Although he gave credit that his cooking is really at a high level, for some reason Zhang thought that the young master was doing anything in life just to earn money, and logically, he was saving up for a bribe from the clan. Chongwan thought for a bit and wanted to object about the bribe, but he thought that if that very bowl of noodles was considered a bribe, then yes, he cunningly became a guanxi with the Chigal clan, and this shocked Zhang. The silence of the night street was cut by the quiet cry of Zhang, who could not believe that a bowl of noodles had become the pass into the Chigal family. Master Ryu was especially good because of his honesty and modesty, so he confessed to Zhang that although he did not understand life, he believed that a bowl of delicious food could at least make a person a little happy. These words worked in such a way that Zhang was again thrown into memories of his childhood, but in appearance he simply stood as if bewitched. That day, in one of the houses, a confident voice of a boy could be heard shouting to his mother that he had come up with a brilliant idea. And of course, Mom asked what her sweet son had already planned, and little Zhang proudly declared that he wanted to become a famous chef, thanks to which he would achieve success and earn a lot of money for the family. The woman, as always, was cooking something in the kitchen at the time of the conversation and gave her son some wise advice that earning money is great, but to become a real chef, you need to think about more than just money. Although Zhang was still very young, he really wanted to know what a cook should strive for besides money in order to become a true master of his craft. Mom lifted a spoonful of soup to smell its aroma and explained to the little boy that a cook's skill is demonstrated when he can warm the souls of both himself and the customer with his food. That's why Zhang had always loved his mother's food so much, and now he also admired her wisdom, which he was beginning to gradually understand. Zhang woke up and apologized to Ryu for perhaps talking too much, but the young master was more worried about his partner's condition looking at his face. A smile appeared on the adult man's face from warm memories, and tears flowed from his eyes as little Zhang finally thawed out, and only now did he understand why his mother was always happy and smiled no matter what. Chongwan didn't know how to act in such situations and tried to console his colleague by asking him to calm down, and Zhang, wiping away his tears with his hand, asked the young master for a favor. Zhang understood that because of his loss, according to the rules, he should remove the knife and cooking from his life, but in fact he would really like to try to continue cooking when he finds a place for himself. If of course Ryu is not against it. The guy nodded in agreement and thought to himself that of course he was not against Zhang continuing his cooking business because he himself wanted to ask him about it. Zhang bowed to the young man, thanking him and calling him by name, but then corrected himself and addressed him as the Dragon of Culinary Arts. Master Zhang most likely said these words mostly to himself, but he also indicated to Chongwan that from now on he would change and his cooking would bring happiness to people. After this promise, Zhang turned around and walked towards the exit, and Ryu, watching him, thought that in fact he was a good man and everything would definitely work out well for him too. The young master was confident in his statement because he already knew from his previous life that the dish that Zhang had prepared and was now dirty would play an important role in the future. Ryu recalled a saying that said that there was no one in Sichuan who could not cook huigoru, and this was due to the fact that in the future, the dish would become a favorite delicacy of the people of Sichuan, which personified the province. Zhongwan sat down on a rock in the backyard next to his assistant and sighed heavily after a busy day, and here was finally a moment when he could relax. But the hater had no time to rest because she had picked up some skills from Hong, and now she was also catching fireflies with her tongue. The young master felt some kind of pleasant feeling towards the place where he was, and now for him there was no place better than Sichuan, because everything here is wonderful. Looking at his hater, Ryu found her behavior strange, but instead he thought about the fact that he still didn't know her name. When the assistant's tongue flew past the young man's face, he asked the dog that she had a name, and he would like to know it. The tongue suddenly disappeared somewhere, which was even stranger, and the guy directed his gaze to the center of eccentricities to understand what would happen next. The hater sat next to Ryu with her tongue hanging out and calling him master, looking at him with her huge puppy eyes as if she was about to cry, and he did not understand what was happening to her. But the little girl stood up confidently on her feet, wagging her tongue, loudly said that her name was Ga Yan, and repeated it for some reason a second and third time, perhaps out of joy. Ga Yan joyfully patted the guy on the sleeve, shouting that he was the only one from the Chego clan who wanted to know her name, and again thanked her master, which scared Ryu a little. The demon hater, as always in her manner, expressed her thoughts to him about the fact that in her eyes, he was simply a pervert, and now Jungwon was no longer angry with her. And so Ryu and Ga, looking at the moon, continued to sit on the stone, when it suddenly corrected its opinion and said that the owner was a kind pervert, for which the young man in turn cursed in his head, a nasty little brat. The night was already very deep, and the day of the competition was quite eventful. So after some time, Ryu stretched well, yawned, and climbed down from the stone. The tired master, barely able to move, complained out loud that now he had to drag himself all the way to the hotel, and Ga shouted that when they returned, the owner would cook her some noodles. From behind him, Yan was running through a field of flowers, shouting at the guy what he was doing here, apparently already looking for him. Ryu thought that the lady was hungry, and sighed heavily and said that she had not done anything special here but was just resting. The nervous butterfly sharply told the young man that now was not the time to rest, and he needed her, so he had to follow her immediately, and Jongwon still thought that the girl was so hungry. For the first time, the young master saw Yan in despair, and with tears in her eyes, asking for help, and after she explained that her father had been poisoned by Hadong, the guy realized that things were bad. Ryu couldn't believe what had just dawned on him, and he had only just begun to think about whether Yan had actually made an attempt to treat her father. The girl covered her face with her hands, sobbing even louder, explaining that she was only repeating everything that the master himself had taught her, which confirmed the young man's guesses. When the guests wanted more, Ryu returned to the table, but at the same time he explained to Yong how to cut the fish and asked her to watch carefully. The butterfly, watching the process, simultaneously asked questions that interested her, such as whether the master knew which parts of the fugu were poisonous, after which she learned that everything depended on the type of Hayden. Ryu clearly demonstrated and explained that one should avoid blood and gills, as well as eyeballs, intestines, and liver, since all of this is poisonous. Yan listened, fascinated, trying not to show how much she liked the master at work, but her face gave her away, and Ryu, in turn, continued to tell her that the knives were changed so often because poison could get on the tool when cutting each part. Here Mrs. Tan became interested in what was lying on the plate, but nothing happened to it, and this part of the fish was not brought to the table. On the plate were testicles or testicles of the Hayden, which were an edible and non-poisonous part of the fugu and could be prepared in any way, but if the testicles were fresh, they could be eaten raw. The butterfly was so surprised that it turns out the fish has a completely edible and safe part that, just in case, she asked the master again, to which he answered in the affirmative. Chongwon told the lady that the testicles were called Shishir's breasts for their taste and softness because the seminal vesicles of the pufferfish are white and tender like the breasts of the legendary Chinese beauty Shishir, but there was little of this piece, so it was not brought to the table. Yan had already thought of something for herself and enthusiastically asked Ryu that if she practiced enough, she would be able to do it just as well, to which the young man replied that the girl would definitely succeed. The guy didn't tell Yan this, but he was sure that since the girl owned a knife and was also familiar with poison, she would really succeed, and he warned the lady out loud not to forget about caution. And now Ryu looked at the plate, remembering how he taught the butterfly to cut fish, realizing that he had made a mistake, and that he first of all needed to be more careful. Miss Tan explained to the master that when she shared with her father that Ryu taught her how to cut fish, he voiced his desire to try, and the young man asked where the master was now. Chungwon explained to the girl that these were not testicles but ovaries, which on the contrary were poisonous and even deadly. While the boys were running towards Mr. Tan, Yan asked again if this was really not the safe part, and Ryu upset her by answering that this was the most dangerous part of the fish. The girl was overcome with panic, that because of her carelessness, her father could die because she had confused such similar parts of the fish. Ryu also reproached himself for the fact that if you don't have enough experience, then it's really easy to make a mistake, which is what happened to Yon, and all because the guy didn't show her everything properly. While the team was running, the young man asked how much time had passed since the gentleman had eaten the poisonous part, and the butterfly said that the father had been at the table at 2 o'clock. By the time they ran towards him, 4 hours had already passed, but Ryu didn't say anything about it, but only asked everyone to speed up. Poor Yon burst into tears, begging the master to promise her that he would save her father, since he had once already been able to save his sister Jong. It was very difficult to admit, but even remembering his previous life, Ryu knew that after 1,000 years, an antidote to the fugu poison had not been invented, and yet there was a last risky but salvation option. As he ran, Jongwon shouted at Ga-yeon to take care of Mrs. Tan while he was already thinking about his plan of action. The butterfly stopped abruptly, telling everyone that they had arrived, and the boys also stopped because there was no further to go. Ryu was surprised that they were standing at the entrance to the cave, where there were also guards, but apparently the overlord needed it that way. The bodyguards were surprised when Miss Tan appeared and asked why she was here with strangers. But Yon didn't care about the guard's words, and she simply went inside saying that her father was there now and asked Ryu to follow her quickly. One of the bodyguards told the lady that entry was prohibited for strangers according to the rules they always adhered to. The security blocked the young man's path, asking for forgiveness from Yon and explaining that they could not let a stranger inside. While the bodyguard was trying to tell the master something about the impossibility of violating the rules of the forbidden territory, a butterfly appeared behind him and, putting her hand on his shoulder, simply said that they didn't have time for this nonsense. And when the guard turned to Mrs. Tan, the first thing he came face to face with was her fist, with which she more clearly explained her haste. Ryu's heart sank when he saw how the fist of a fragile girl broke a spear in half and then crushed her face into the head of a huge man. The force of Yongyong's blow was so powerful that the guard not only fell to the ground, he also hit his head so hard that dust rose up. Being angry at the bodyguard and still worried about her father, the butterfly sternly said a wise thing that without a head, the family code of honor is useless. The girl ran inside, calling the others to follow her while it was not too late, and Ryu ran looking at the guard, who was probably already a dead man, and the other realized that he should just pretend that he did not see anything. When the guys entered the cave, Mr. Tang was sitting on a rock in the lotus position under the moonlight, and around him was a poisonous fog that was not like the first one when the guy and the Lord met. Jiwoon was sweating profusely, and there was dark circles under his eyes, and he exhaled heavily from the feeling that an eternity had already passed. But suddenly he noticed Ryu. The guy immediately covered his mouth with his hand, watching as the poisonous fog grew larger, and this time it was much stronger. Mr. Tan, exhaling even more poison like a darken, told the young man that he did not look very good, although something similar should have been said to the ruler, and Chongwon assumed that he was trying to displace the poison with the help of his chi. Yon continued to cry from despair and asked her father for forgiveness for the fact that she was to blame for the fact that he could die. Ryu immediately noticed the symptoms of poisoning such as exhaustion and cyanosis, as well as muscle spasms from which an ordinary person would have died instantly. But Jiwoon even continued to speak and told his daughter that it was his fault that he had not yet found a cure. The guy himself had already started coughing from the fog, but he understood that he needed to hurry, because what the master was trying to do was ineffective, and if he himself died, then no one would help the ruler. Ga-yeon approached the owner and handed him some kind of bag just at the moment when the master himself could barely see and breathe, at a loss as to what to do. Butterfly tried to look out from behind Jongwon to see what was in that bag, because at the moment she was hoping and looking for anything to save her father. From the bag onto his hand, the master poured the root of the same aconite, only from the island of Kusashima, but the same flowers are in the backyard. Despite his dying state, the Poison Lord's mind had not yet become clouded, and he was interested in what the young man had come up with. Yon was even more alarmed and reminded Ryu that this was poisonous aconite which remained dangerous, so she expressed her confusion as to why it was needed now. Jongwon confirmed the girl's words about the deadly danger of the plant, which has no equal among other poisons, but at the same time, he had an idea. The young man decided to use a method called idokusidoku, which meant removing poison with another poison, or in simple terms, fighting fire with fire. Thanks to his past life, Ryu remembered that from a scientific point of view, the plan could work, because the fugu poison tetrodotoxin permanently blocks the body's sodium channels, thereby paralyzing the fish's muscles, which leads to cardiac arrest and death. In turn, aconitine from aconite has the same effect, but the mechanism of action is opposite, due to which the permeability of sodium channels increases and thus over-irritation occurs. The master understood that ultimately the poison of fugu and aconite would lead to death, but there was a chance to delay it with the help of counteractions of the poison mechanism. Ryu looked at the root of the flower and understood that in a normal case the person would have died in any of the options, but not in this world. The hope that the risky plan might work was reinforced by the boy's understanding that in this world, normality was completely different from that of his previous life, since here the chi gates of martial artists are open wider than those of ordinary people. The master remembered how people from this world reacted to his dishes, which were quite ordinary, and this only confirmed that the inhabitants of this world are more susceptible to external stimuli. In a very grave condition, before falling, Ryu handed the root to Lord Tan, thinking that he did not understand at all what would happen to the ruler when he took the second poison. Yeon really didn't like this idea, and she tried to dissuade her father, but he took the root from the guy's hands, already showing that he was ready to take a risk. Jivun looked at the familiar flower, wondering if the guy was really asking him to take another poison now. Ryu looked closely at the gentleman and confidently replied that he was indeed asking to eat another poison, and he himself thought that if he did not do anything now, he would definitely die. The poison lord found it strange that he had never heard of such a way to save himself, but he did not ask the young man anything. Instead of asking about the method of fighting fire with fire, Mr. Tan turned to his daughter, to which she responded instantly by worrying about every word her father said. The father was at the limit of his abilities, so he finally asked his child if she trusted this young master Ryu Jongwon. Behind Yon, the guy fell to his knees, coughing from the lack of fresh air, but Guy Yon was nearby and made sure that the owner did not pass out completely. Butterfly put her hand on her heart, showing with this gesture that she was speaking sincerely now, and answered her father that she trusted Ryu completely. After his daughter's answer, Jiwoon believed her words and began to chew the root of the poisonous flower, and in this state, the thought flashed through his head that he envied Chan. Yon looked at her father, who already looked paler than death, and kept calling out to him to make sure he was still here with her and alive. Even more poisonous fog began to come out of the overlord's mouth, as if someone had thrown a smoke bomb inside him, the evaporation of which was endless. Ryu was gasping for breath and was already breathing heavily just as the little dog turned towards Mr. Tan and told his master that something was clearly wrong with him as implied. The gentleman's veins bulged, and his muscles became as if they were made of stone, which indicated that the poison had taken effect, but it was not yet clear in which direction, because he exhaled the poisonous mist and screamed furiously. Poor Yan saw her father in such a state for the first time and was most afraid of losing him, so she continued to call him loudly. The overlord clenched his teeth from the terrible spasmodic pain, and his entire body was covered with bulging veins, and if it weren't for his hardening with poisons, he would have simply fallen dead. Jongwon's vision began to darken, but he looked at the gentleman until the last possible moment. But as an ordinary person, it was difficult for him to withstand even the poisonous fumes. Ryu thought that he was definitely finished and passed out, just when a column of purple smoke that Jawoon was releasing came out of the cave with an explosion. While in a state of deep sleep due to lack of oxygen, the guy was overwhelmed by visions in the form of memories of the owner of the body and mind, Ryu Jongwon, where there were houses burning in flames and someone's voice giving the order to find the witch Yun Sol Hua. A terrible man commanded his army, saying that if they found out that one of the townspeople was hiding a witch, they were to be killed immediately without hesitation. A man with pale skin and black eyes threatened the witch out loud that she would pay for betraying the heavenly demon with her own life. The commander warned his warriors that if they did not want to fall under the control of the violator, then they should under no circumstances resist her technique of the web of 10 souls. While most of the houses in the city were ablaze with fire, in one of them, one could still hear the whisper of a father talking to his son Ryu. The father fell on his knees in front of the boy, whose eyes were wet, exhausted, and with many weapons that hit him in the back, and asked for forgiveness for the false hope that they would be able to hide. The father asked his son to listen to him carefully, and explained that no matter where life takes him, and no matter what he hears or sees, he should never think of his mother as a bad person. With a battered and bloody hand, the father touched his child's face for the last time, reminding him of their beloved mother who gave up everything to love them. The same creepy commander appeared above the man, having found what was closest to the witch, and the father, stroking the boy on the head, asked him not to fall asleep. Little Ryu was already very scared and did not understand what was happening, and now right before his eyes his father was being killed and blood was flying on his face. And at that moment, when the baby called his dad and blood gushed onto his face, Ryu felt such a strong slap that he woke up. Sitting over the guy in tears was an angry Yawn, who was shouting at the guy to wake up immediately and had already swung for a second blow to the face. A scream flashed through the young man's head as he remembered the Lord of Poison, and the first thing that came to his mind was that the master had died, and now Yong would kill him. The master tearfully asked for forgiveness from Mrs. Tan, shouting that he had done everything possible to save her father, and the girl began to scold him as she had never scolded him since they met. After Yon tearfully told the guy what a fool and idiot he was, she screamed that she was very scared for Ryu and worried, and then fell on his chest and continued to sob, from which the master was in such shock that he definitely woke up. The first thing that Zhongwan asked to at least somehow clarify the situation was where Mr. Tan was, but the butterfly assured him that he didn't have to worry. Yon Yon held Ryu tightly by her clothes and continued to cry on her master's chest, explaining that her father survived thanks to him. What a relief the guy felt after hearing these words. He simply lay back down on the ground and even smiled and thanked the heavens that everything worked out. The guys remained lying on the floor, with Yon on top, which is why her father, leaning on the beam, cleared his throat so that the young people would notice him, and then added that young people today are generally shameless. Jivun looked as if nothing had happened to him, and continued to complain that the world was going nowhere, while the king of poisons stretched one of his whiskers and advised him to pretend that he hadn't noticed anything. Yon still hadn't let go of the master, even though he had already sat down, and Jiwoon, sighing heavily, told his father that it turned out that he had lost the bet with Chan, and then the king poked his son's nose in that he had neither shame nor conscience to bet on his daughter's marriage. The old man continued to tug at his son's mustache, and Ga joined in. The father also teased his son, asking how many people worthy of the rank of a dragon were there in the Middle Lands, because if everything was so sad, then he wouldn't be able to win the bet. But the grandfather would not be himself if he did not suggest to his beloved son an option to even the score. And when the king made a thoughtful look on his face, both Jivun and the assistant repeated it. Ryu quietly wanted to ask Yon how long she was going to sit like this, but she, in her usual manner, asked the guy to shut up, and the old man and his son, looking at the young people, said it was a draw regarding the bet. The next day the weather was fine, and despite the difficult night, fortunately the life of the city continued with all its inhabitants without losses. Ryu had already finished packing his things in his room, checking that he hadn't forgotten anything and putting everything in one place. He breathed a sigh of relief. The master wiped his forehead, from which sweat was pouring like a river, because he had prepared food and other supplies to return to the tavern, and considered that he was ready to leave, but Ga thought otherwise, finishing the last donut in front of the guy. Now that the young man could think with a fresh head, he thought about the fact that he still had not found an explanation for that strange dream while he was unconscious. Ryu was very worried that the pictures he saw were too real, that they did not appear in the memory of this body in any way. But the last time in the water when his mother came to him, there was the same feeling. Zhongwan was infuriated by the fact that he had already seen too much, and there was still no explanation for it, and he grabbed his head from the closed circle and thoughts that he was already tired of. Turning sharply to Ga, the master shouted with all his anger that he urgently needed to do something, and as one of the options, he took the preparation of eel and ordered the hater to quickly bring Taurine, and she stared at him as if he was crazy. The eel did not start preparing, but thoughts about the tavern were able to distract Ryu, and after his thoughts he was also distracted by the noise outside the door of his home. As it turned out, Yon was shaking the spirit out of the messenger, shouting at him that he could not take the master because he still needed rest, and the man could barely speak but still tried to explain that he just had to deliver a letter from the master. Zhongwan was taken aback both by the messenger's words and by Ga's pointing him in the direction where what had been prepared for them to return to the tavern stood. The little girl ran up to a luxurious large carriage with two beautiful white horses harnessed and was ready to hug them to death. The butterfly didn't want the master to leave so much that she screamed to get out of here and come back after some time, or better yet, not to come at all, and continued to beat the messenger without even noticing how Ryu himself approached them. Only when the guy wanted to know what was going on here, Yon, terribly embarrassed, said that nothing special and ordered Ryu to run back to rest. But the messenger asked if it was Mr. Ryu in front of him, and he confirmed that yes. The poor fellow was finally able to escape from the clutches of the poisonous butterfly and pulled out a scroll from under his clothes, announcing that he had a message for his master. The ambassador unrolled the scroll and read that it was a letter from Patriarch Chagall, addressed to Master Ryu Chongwan. The young man was surprised that he had received a letter, but he listened attentively as the messenger read that, firstly, Chan was grateful to him as a representative of their family who had honored the king of poisons at his holiday. And the second important moment was the message that the ceremony was almost ready, and therefore an official invitation to it was sent with Ryu's letter. The master completely forgot that he was supposed to take part in the brotherly oath ceremony, and that they had agreed on this before the Chigal family left his tavern. The messenger folded the letter, indicating that the message was finished, and indicated to the master that a carriage had been prepared for his comfortable travel. Ryu began to rave about how he was finally returning to his normal life. Or almost normal, considering how he started the first day of opening the tavern and what happened to him from that moment on. Yan tried to disguise the fact that she wanted the guy to stay in Chengdu for a while longer and recommended that he stay here for a while as a rest after such hard days. But Ryu didn't know what the girl really felt, so he didn't quite understand her persuasion. The master explained to the lady that in his opinion he had no time to rest since he and Chan already had an agreement and they would have to hit the road. The butterfly could not stand it, and in order not to show her disappointment, pretended to be angry, and turning around to leave, told the young man to do as he pleased. Chungwan noted to himself that the lady was very angry today, and the envoy asked the gentleman to inform him when he would be ready to set off on his journey. Hiding away from Ryu's house, the girl felt mixed feelings and understood that it was already too late, and this only made things worse. Heavy thoughts kept creeping into my head about why the Chagall family was in such a hurry to get married and whether Zhong was really that beautiful. Meanwhile, in Chan's room, she could be heard quietly humming a song, and there were sweets and tea on the table. The lady herself, continuing to hum a song, drew something at the table in complete silence and calm, so she could completely immerse herself in the process of creation. Zhong drew her character from memory, and at the moment could not remember whether Zhongwan's nose was sharper or softer. The lady thoughtfully placed her hand on her cheek in an attempt to remember the master's face, but it was useless since quite a lot of time had passed, so Chan simply basked in the hope that the guy was doing well. At some point, before continuing to draw, the girl silently and very suspiciously looked around as if she could be watched. And when Chan made sure that no one was looking, she grabbed a piece of paper and still finished drawing the guy's nose, only more from her imagination that it was sharp and masculine, and he himself was more masculine. As a result, having embodied her fantasies on paper, which in no way coincided with the real picture, the young lady was satisfied, considering that this was the ideal portrait of Chongwan. Suddenly the doors opened and one of the assistants suddenly entered the room, wondering what the lady was doing and why it was so quiet there. Poor Chan was so scared and blushed that the first thing she thought of doing was crumpling up the piece of paper with the drawing and answering that she wasn't doing anything like that, but the assistant had already noticed something in her hands and wanted to see it. When the little girl approached the girl, the crumpled circle flew somewhere to another part of the room, and now Chan decided to find out why the assistant decided to come to her so late. The little one raised the scroll above her, officially declaring that a messenger from the Tang clan had arrived and brought a letter about the pervert that the lady so wanted to know about. Chan unrolled the scroll with such enthusiasm, wanting to finally read the news about her future husband from the Tang clan, that she didn't even pay attention to the fact that the assistant called the guy a pervert. But no matter how perverted the master was, the assistant also really wanted to know what they wrote in the letter and asked the mistress about it, asking her to read it out loud. From the first lines, Chan was already proud of the one who would be next to her, since Mr. Ryu, according to the Tang clan, had successfully demonstrated his high culinary skills many times, which in turn earned the respect of the Poison King since he saved the feast. While the crumpled piece of paper with the courageous Ryu was lying on the floor, Chan read about a truly courageous guy who was awarded the title of Dragon of Culinary Arts for his merits, and in addition, he saved the patriarch of the Tang clan from death. The assistant praised the pervert, who turned out to be surprisingly useful, but immediately introduced the fact that he was saving the patriarch. Chan was embarrassed when the assistant reminded her about saving her from suffocation and explained to the little girl again that it was first aid. But the assistant again wanted to logically explain to the lady that if Ryu saved the patriarch and he is a pervert, then it turns out that he saved the master as well as the lady. Chung's eyes widened like they had never opened before, because she too imagined Ryu giving Jiwoon CPR. The lady tried to convince herself that this was just a method of treatment, but her imagination could no longer be stopped, so she was simply taken aback. From the house, along with the wind that carried the sakura petals, came the voice of the assistant who was trying to shout to the lady, but she was already hovering far from the ground. Under the moonlight in a huge tree stood Mr. Chan and another old man talking about how good and bad Chan was feeling, and how it turned out, according to the old man, after daily checks the girl was getting worse. Mr. Chigal wanted to know if the wedding would go without problems, but it was very difficult to predict something like that, so he would have to solve the problems as they came up. The old man explained to the gentleman that in moments of strong emotions, the young lady's symptoms intensify more and more each time, but at the moment, a decline in them was noticed, but the reason for this lull was not known. The elder tried to find the words to bring out the root of the problem, but Shigal said that there was no point in somehow veiling what was not a secret. Mr. Chan himself understood that the energy of the Northern Sea Palace could be a problem for everything, because something similar had happened to his wife and mother. The old man sighed heavily at this awkward moment, and Cheon decided to turn his attention to the fact that the most important guest, Master Zhongwan, would soon arrive. The men stood further under the tree, looking at the houses in the moonlight, and Chagall voiced his hopes that the ceremony would still go well. The day of Ryu's departure came, and he stood at the entrance to Chengdu saying goodbye to the Lord and King of Poisons, but at the same time, hoping to meet again someday. Jivun laughed at the guy and his serious expression and overall seriousness, so that at first he somehow didn't even understand what was wrong, and the dog was packing things on the carriage while the men were saying goodbye. Mr. Tang made it clear to the young man that he had saved his life, which meant that from now on he was a welcome guest of the Tang clan at any time and at any opportunity. Ryu was a little embarrassed by such generosity, but thanked the gentleman, and Jiwoon asked him to say hello to Chan upon his arrival. Thinking that perhaps in ancient China they expressed gratitude by calling you a welcome guest, the young man said goodbye to the gentleman. The messenger asked if the assistant and Ryu were ready to leave, to which the guy symbolically knocked on the carriage, indicating that they could move on, and they set off. Jiwoon, watching the departing guests, shared with his father that the boy had changed dramatically in his eyes in such a short time, and the old man confirmed that the title of the culinary dragon was only the beginning of the young man's path and that he had everything ahead of him. The King of Poisons, in turn, came from a slightly different angle to discuss something else, and pointed out that the guy had a great future and that one day he would be able to have at least 3 wives, and then added that they both understood what Yon Yon was hiding. Well, in the end, the elder pointed out his granddaughter's love for Master Ryu, which was confirmed by her father, considering her feelings for the young man obvious. Jiwoon voiced his thoughts about how great it would be for Ryu to be ready to take Yon as his wife, and Grandpa confirmed this by pointing out that she should be a wife and not a concubine. The Lord, getting excited about his plan, continued to say that such a plan would help to make the dispute end in a draw, and the old man picked up the idea and added that, in addition, they would finally be able to marry off Yon. When Ryu turned around to look at Chengdu, he saw a huge poisonous cloud in the form of an ominous grin, and it looked quite creepy. The guy didn't understand what happened there, and why the poisonous cloud rose, but he was glad that he left in time and thus stayed alive. This time, Ga Yan was riding on top, not on Chongwan's hump, but on all the bags that were lying on the roof of the carriage, and she remembered something and wanted to find out from the owner. Ga, like a spider, slid down to the window where Ryu was sitting, and reminded him that he hadn't even said goodbye to Yon Yon before leaving, and that it had really embarrassed him. But Zhongwan explained to the dog that he had been trying to talk to the lady for the remaining days before departure, but she seemed to be out of sorts. Ryu recalled how the girl could simply pass by and not even say hello, and sometimes she would even avoid him, and as soon as she saw him, she would turn around and walk in the opposite direction. In addition to everything, the master felt guilty that because of him, Jiwoon almost died, which in turn made Yon clearly very upset. Ga Yon had already crawled onto the head of one of the horses, shedding tears from the sad story of the owner and the fact that instead of saying goodbye, he left the girl a culinary gift. And when the master announced that he had also prepared something for them and the hater, Ga was already there, holding onto the window door. The dog, as always, very rudely began to ask for food immediately because she was terribly hungry. But when Ryu opened the lid of the box, Ga looked at the dish in fascination and even became quiet. And while the team was already on the road to the Tang Clan estate, a butterfly appeared in front of the father and not believing what she heard, asked again if Ryu had already left. The girl felt so sad in her soul because the master left and didn't even say goodbye that she didn't notice anything else except that. But the father was wise and restrained and asked his daughter to sit down at the table, but she looked at her father in silence for some time but did not sit down. Yon said that she was not hungry and lowered her head and became so sad that it seemed that a cloud with rain would appear right above her. The butterfly was about to leave, but Jiwoon immediately clarified that the food on the table was not simple, but prepared especially for her by Master Ryu. The father explained to his daughter that instead of saying goodbye, the young master had done something much more significant than one could have imagined. Just as Ga in the carriage stared at the box with the dish, now the lady also looked at the bowl, asking what it was. Ryu, as always, distinguished himself with an exquisite and appetizing presentation of the dish, which was nothing more than a bowl of river eel. The demon hater stood there drooling, holding the box in her hands, not daring to even scoop up such beauty with a spoon, and also asked the owner what kind of culinary masterpiece it was. The cook was already enjoying the food he had prepared himself, and with his mouth full, explained to the dog that this dish was made from manlio fish, which means eel. Here Ga also began to crunch on the delicacy, also with her mouth full, saying that this was a fish that looked like a snake, and she would never have thought in her life that it could be so tasty. Again, if we compare the time from the young man's past life in this era, then in this world the eel was not so widespread. Besides, Zhongwan knew that even though the poison of eels was nowhere near the poison of fugu, the fish was still poisonous, and one also needed to know how to work with it. Because of their peculiarity, eels were usually kept in a pond near the palace and not in the pantry where the rest of the food was kept. Ryu was once again able to surprise with something new those who tried his cooking, because in that era, people did not want to eat eel because of its snake-like shape and mucus, and the way the fish moved abruptly also caused inconvenience during cooking. As with fugu, if the eel was not prepared correctly, there was a risk of poisoning from ichthyotoxin, which was in the mucus and blood of the fish and manifested itself in symptoms such as vomiting and tissue inflammation as well as bloody stools. Zhongwan knew that despite their reluctance to deal with the slippery and poisonous fish, the curiosity of the cooks of that era got the better of them, and after some time, having gained experience and knowledge, they were able to tame this wild fish. And when the chefs had already tried many options for processing the fish, they managed to reveal the rich taste and tender texture of eel meat, and it was impossible to compare it with any other fish. Finally, it was possible to recognize the dog that so adored its owner's cooking and was now gobbling up the dish as usual at the speed of light. Ga Yan was ready to completely climb into the food box. It was so delicious, but Ryu continued to eat calmly, thinking that he had prepared the dish not at all because of the taste of the product. The guy realized that it was difficult for him to express in words the real reason for preparing this dish, but he tried to convey the main idea with the main ingredient. If it were possible to show the sensations that Jiwoon experienced while eating a bowl of food from Master Ryu, it would be explosions of fireworks, and the master would once again be convinced that the guy is still a dragon. The head of the Tang clan was delighted that he had never eaten such a delicious fish, but he had to calm his delight a little because he looked at his daughter. Poor Yan looked at the bowl of food, and she couldn't even swallow a bite as she imagined Ryu and how he looked while preparing this dish. The father decided to stir up his daughter a little, who seemed to have grown together with the table and could not touch the food, so he turned to her. Jiwoon told the pure truth that he knows the young master less than Yan knows, but at the same time, even for him it is obvious that thanks to his cooking skills, he is able to make a story out of food that no writer could tell. The father explained the wisdom of what the master had put into the dish as a message that the eel spends most of its life in the river, and when the time comes it goes to the sea. But it is as if he had made a promise to himself that he always returns to where he left from. And to make it even clearer, Jiwoon said that Ryu, like this eel, left hope in the dish that he would definitely return. And having finished his story, the father asked why his daughter didn't try the food, but then he looked at the little girl who was already stuffing herself with food. A Yan, overwhelmed with feelings for the young man, mercilessly ate the dish, angry at him and calling him a stupid fool. In an instant, the butterfly's bowl was completely empty, and large drops began to fall on the table, and the girl thought that even like this, under the guise of saying goodbye, it was too much. It was too delicious and too painful, which is why the poor thing began to cry tears the size of hail that fell into the bowl while she was still finishing the master's cooking. Meanwhile, the carriage moved further and further away from Chengdu, thereby weighing down the heads and hearts of both the boy and the girl with unspoken thoughts. The young man realized for himself that no matter what life he was in, there are things that are not only difficult, but sometimes impossible to explain in words, and everyone tries to explain it with what he can do best. Ryu distracted himself with thoughts about how eel is good for male potency, and that, by the way, it is very difficult to explain in words. The messenger turned to the gentleman, reminding him that if there was such a need, he could ask and they would stop for rest or a snack. The master thanked the man and wanted to know something else, but Ga Young distracted him a little by loudly eating a donut. But the guy returned to his question, and a little embarrassed, still wanted to know what kind of ceremony Mr. Chan was preparing. The messenger smiled, repeating the guy's question, surprised that he didn't know where he was going, and clarified that it was a wedding ceremony. Chungwan replied that he understood everything, but he froze for a few seconds and again repeated to himself the word wedding, which echoed dully in his head. The guy grabbed the wooden window of the carriage, staring at the road and how far they had already traveled, and he couldn't believe that he wasn't going to the brotherly oath ceremony.